أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على الأتمان الأكملان على نبي الرحمة محمد بن عبد الله آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Let us Praise Allah Almighty, because of His countless blessings and favors, we are able to participate in these important virtual events. May peace and blessings be upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who guided us to the right ways for all aspects of our lives, including transactions. Her Excellency Ms. Destry Damayanti, Senior Deputy Governor, Bank Indonesia, His Excellency Honorable Nik Muhammad Dean, Director General Labuan Financial Services Authority, Malaysia, and Vice Chairman of IIFM, His Excellency Honorable Dr. Umar Husseini, Chief Executive Officer, International Islamic Liquidity Management Corporation, IILM, His Excellency Honorable Mr. Ijlal Ahmed Alvi, Chief Executive Officer, International Islamic Financial Markets, IIFM. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, to everyone I say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, as per your location and wherever you are. And I greet you all with the greeting of peace, the greeting of the people of Jannah, of paradise. We say it in Arabic, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be unto you all. To our hosts and all the Indonesian friends, brothers and sisters, saya ucapkan selamat petang. Sebab dekat sini pukul 9.30 pagi, dekat sana pukul 1.30 petang. May Allah Almighty bless your times with goodness and happiness. And I pray to Allah for further progress and prosperity for your dearest, peaceful and blessed country, Indonesia, the Muslim majority country in the world, and dear to our hearts as well. Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today and participate in this important seminar on global benchmark rate reforms, challenges and solutions for Islamic financial industry. We are indeed delighted and pleased to know that more than 400 participants have registered for this event. We pray and hope to achieve the objectives of our seminar today, which is to find solutions and new ideas for further progress, prosperity, and sustainable development of this blessed industry, i.e. Islamic financial industry. Ladies and gentlemen, the best thing to start with in this blessed virtual gathering is the recitation of the Noble Quran. Therefore, I will invite our brother, Sheikh Ustad Herianto, to recite some verses from the Noble Quran. Silakan Ustad Herianto.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والله جعل لكم الأرض بساطا لتسلكوا منها سبلا فجاجا قال نوح رب إنهم عصوني واتبعوا من لم يزده ماله وولده إلا خسارا ومكروا مكرا كبارا صدق الله العظيم.
Masya Allah, tabarakallah. Terima kasih Ustaz Herianto atas suara menarik ini, yang bacaan yang menarik. Terima kasih banyak. Thank you very much for this beautiful recitation. May Allah reward you. Excellencies, distinguished participants, the International Islamic Financial Market, IIFM, since its inception, has been striving to create awareness in the Islamic financial markets across the globe through its ready-to-use, practical, and Sharia-compliant standards. The mission of IIFM is to promote high standards of application practice based on ethical values in the Islamic financial industry across the globe through unification of agreements, harmonization of Sharia, and transparency in implementation. All these under the unmatched assistance and support and guidance of its esteemed Sharia scholars, which includes renowned scholars with extensive knowledge and experience of the contemporary Islamic banking system. To date, IIFM has published 15 comprehensive documentation and product confirmation standards, as well as related guidance notes across 4 key areas, namely liquidity management, Islamic hedging, sukuk, trade finance, both funded and unfunded transactions. In addition to the issuance of well-received annual sukuk reports and other publications and research papers. Please kindly do visit IIFM website. For these publications, it's all free. The most recent documents launched by IIFM is the Sharia compliant standard structuring solutions for risk-free rate RFR implementation for Murabaha and Ijara transaction. In Arabic, we call it معيار حلول هيكلية لمؤشر خالي المخاطر المتوافق مع أحكام الشريعة لمعاملات المرابحة والإجارة. Alhamdulillah, the Islamic financial industry has adopted these standards in their day-to-day activities, which is significantly contributed in the continuous and meaningful progress in addressing the critical factors such as reducing costs, shortening negotiation time, and minimizing operational risk arising from financial transactions. Ladies and gentlemen, when the UK's Financial Conduct Authority announced that the LIBOR will be cancelled, the LIBOR will be abolished after year 2021, and the transition to risk-free rate benchmark RFR Given the importance of this subject for the development of the Islamic financial industry across the globe, IIFM initiated the market awareness exercise on transitions from IBOs to RFRs, and highlighted the challenges posed in particular to Islamic financial product structures, transactions, documentation, etc., due to these new significant developments. In order to form a consensus around the development of workable standardized Sharia compliant solutions, IIFM formed core working groups for financing, hedging, and sukuk. These working groups composed of major institutions around the world to prepare a consultation paper that can be used as basis for deliberations in this regard. On the 24th of November of last year, 2020, IIFM held a virtual consultative meeting that helped to form a consensus on developing practical and unified solutions to overcome these challenges. A very large number of scholars, lawyers, and practitioners around the world participated in this virtual meeting. And the outcome of this consultative meeting was the publication of the industry's first and only white paper titled Global Benchmark Rate Reform and Implications of IBOR Transition for Islamic Finance. That was in March year 2021. Distinguished participants, it is well established in Sharia, in the teaching of Sharia, that it is permissible to use a benchmark, any benchmark, in order to determine the profit of, such as of something like murabaha or ijara, etc. On this basis, four proposed Islamic financing solutions have been reached and published by IIFM, and they are in brief: 2 structured solutions for murabaha transactions, variant 1, dual tranche structure, a long-term murabaha, and a series of spot murabaha, and variant 2, single tranche with 2 undertakings, single tranche with 2 undertakings, and this is what we call the ceiling rate structure. And for ijara, 2 structured solutions for ijara transactions as well. Variant 1, daily rental over the calculation periods. Variant 2, breaking the calculation period into sub-rental periods. The honorable scholars, speakers will explain these structures in detail, inshallah. Especially we have our honorable brother, the mastermind of all this. May Allah protect him, brother Hajj Kurram. Jazakallahu khairan for his effort on this. Brothers and sisters in Islam, some might say that it is, or this is an opportunity to create a purely Islamic reference rate benchmark. No doubt, a purely Islamic reference rate benchmark is needed. However, until this desired goal is achieved, IIFM believes that the activities of Islamic financial institutions must continue without any interruption through the use of current and existing benchmarks. That's our belief, in order to meet the urgent needs of Islamic financial institutions in this regard. It is important to note that IIFM is working hard with all the stakeholders of Islamic financial industry globally, such as IILM, IFSB, IOF, and others, to establish a reliable and pure Islamic benchmark for the entire industry. Finally, the objective of this seminar is to have a comprehensive discussion on these solutions that have been published by IIFM and their positive impacts on the Islamic financial industry, as well as a discussion on overcoming the challenges arising from the transition to RFR and the discontinuation of the LIBOR. Distinguished participants, today's discussion in this awareness seminar will mainly focus, as we mentioned earlier, global benchmark rate reforms, challenges and solutions for Islamic financial industry, as described in the program that was sent or distributed to you. But before we proceed into discussions, I would like to invite His Excellency Honorable Mr. Nick Mohammed Dean, Director General Labuan FSA and Vice Chairman of IIFM, to deliver the welcoming address. Over to you, Honorable Nick Mohammed.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. Her Excellency, Ms. Destri Damayanti, Senior Deputy Governor, Bank Indonesia, Brother Ijlal Ahmad Alvi, CEO of International Islamic Financial Market, IIFM, Dr. Umar Hosseini, CEO of International Islamic Liquidity Management Corporation, IILM, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah wa barakatuh, and good afternoon or good morning to my global audience. Foremost, I would like to extend my warm welcome to all the guests to the 8th Indonesia Sharia Economic Festival, ISEF 2021. I wish to express my sincere thanks and appreciation to IIFM and IILM with the support of Bank Indonesia as the gracious host for organizing this seminar to update on global benchmark rate reforms. It is a pleasure for me to join you in this virtual seminar, which I'm sure will be an illuminating and enlightening session of panel experts in sharing their extensive knowledge and thoughts on the current development of phasing out the interbank offered rate, IBOR, and transition to risk-free rates, RFR, or alternative benchmark rates. The announcement made by the former Chief Executive of the UK's Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, Mr. Andrew Bailey, in 2017, marked a formal confirmation that the IBOR settings will be permanently ceased as the interest rate benchmark by December 2021. Due to the inadequacy of underlying IBOR transactions, the benchmark rate is potentially inaccurate to reflect market conditions and unsustainability. Following this development, the global financial market has agreed to use the alternative risk-free benchmark rates, RFR, as it is more reflective of market conditions. The implications of the cessation of IBOR to Islamic finance transactions are still in deliberation by the Islamic organization bodies such as IIFM in developing a united benchmark rate transition, as well as to put forth a plan of potential solutions for the Sharia-compliant use of near risk-free reference rate. According to Fitch Ratings, Islamic banks face more complexities than their counterparts do in the transitioning away from legacy IBOR because of the need to ensure compliance to Sharia. Islamic banks face similar uncertainties to conventional banks from IBOR transition, including increased exposure to profit rate, basis, operational and legal risks, and unclear implications for derivatives, hedging, and accounting. but the transition could be more challenging due to Sharia compliance implications. In the case of Malaysia, the Sharia Advisory Council, SAC of the Central Bank of Malaysia, has ruled that the use of the RFR as an alternative benchmark rate to the IBOR or as a fallback benchmark replacement rate after the permanent cessation of IBOR is permissible based on the following justifications. One, the compounding methodology is merely an arithmetic method in determining the term rate, which does not affect compliance of the transaction with Sharia requirements. And secondly, uncertainty or gharar from the adoption of average RFR or backward-looking term rate at the point of payment is mitigated by a proper determination and disclosure of the ceiling price and formula to derive the periodic payment amount to the customer at the inception of the contract. As a mid-shore center, the Labuan International Business and Financial Center, or Labuan IBFC, provides global investors and international businesses with well-regulated and supervised jurisdiction, along with certainty in a currency-neutral operating environment. Since our Labuan banks are predominantly international banks, they are free and allowed to adopt any RFR that suits with their clientele preferences and their business propositions, as long as they remain adherent to the international standard setting policies. Nonetheless, we foresee that the IBOR transition will potentially impact the Labuan banks and financial institutions in the following ways. One, they might need to renegotiate their existing contractual agreement based on the rate used by their counterparts. Two, the different in fallback rates are only for short-term solutions and could increase liquidity risks. And thirdly, increasing in operational costs, particularly in IT and back office costs. Ladies and gentlemen, in line with the global development trend in embracing fintech and digitalization, I would like to take this occasion to highlight that Labuan FSA, as a regulator of the Labuan IBFC, is currently developing its 5-year strategic roadmap for 2022 to 2026 with a theme, revitalizing business and enhancing sustainability of Labuan IBFC as Asia's preferred center. One of the strategic thrusts is to intensify the Islamic finance footing in the region, focusing on advancing innovative digital business solutions, including incorporating the environmental, social, and governance-related, or in short, ESG, as well as other Islamic finance agenda. In 2020, we have issued the framework on digital banking, and more than 80 digital financial services have been established in Labuan. We envision that the initiatives would further enhance Labuan as a preferred jurisdiction, which offers a wide range and quality digital-based solutions that are also Sharia compliant. My beloved guest, before we continue with our event today, I would like to thank the IIFM for its ongoing efforts to market unification, specifically on global standardization of Islamic documentation and product confirmation. I believe many of us here would like to understand more about these benchmark rate reforms, especially in terms of the whys of the transition, the whats of IBOR and RFR, and the hows relating to the impact of Islamic finance. And here we are today, blessed by the Almighty, an opportunity to hear directly from our fellow distinguished experts to provide us with deeper insights on the IBOR transition, its challenges to Islamic finance industry, and strategies to develop a robust Islamic finance structures and solutions, among others. With the anticipation that the IBOR will no longer be published by the end of 2021, market financial players should plan the transition of all IBOR-based exposures, including all existing contracts, to risk-free interest rates in the next couple of months. With a recent publication by IIFM on Sharia compliance standard structuring solutions for RFR, implementation for Murabaha and Ijara transaction, the standard undoubtedly provides tremendous benefit in providing a smooth transition for the Islamic finance In this regard, I would like to sincerely thank and applaud the IIFM and the entire core working group for their exceptional efforts and significant contribution to industry. With this, I wish to express my appreciation to everyone present here today, and I look forward to the panel session ahead. Thank you very much, and wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much, Honorable IIFM Vice President, for this important, informative, and inspiring speech. It is my honor and privilege to invite His Excellency, Honorable Dr. Umar Husseini, Chief Executive Officer, International Islamic Liquidity Management Corporation, IILM, to deliver his welcoming remarks. Over to you, Doctor.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidil Mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Your Excellency, Ms. Damayanti, the Senior Deputy Governor of Bank Indonesia. Your Excellency, Mr. Nick Muhammad Dean, the Director General of Labuan Financial Services Authority and the Vice Chairman of IIFM. Your Excellency, Mr. Ijlal, the CEO of International Islamic Financial Markets, distinguished panelists and guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and a very good afternoon from Kuala Lumpur, and a warm welcome to you all. Let me start by first thanking Bank Indonesia for lending its support to all of us here today by graciously providing the platform for us to come together during the Indonesia Sharia Economic Festival to discuss and learn from one another about a highly interesting topic: global benchmark rate reforms, challenges and solutions for the Islamic finance industry. I would like to also thank the International Islamic Financial Markets, the IIFM, for organizing this virtual seminar together with the IILM, and I commend the hard work that they have put in to bring together all the distinguished speakers, guests from all over the world. The theme of today's seminar could not have been timelier for all of us in the Islamic finance industry in particular, and in the international finance world to a wider extent. We are only 2 months away before the end of 2021, and apart from dealing with a global pandemic, the finance industry worldwide will be facing out the LIBOR benchmark, which has been a cornerstone of financial contracts worldwide for more than 3 decades, and moving towards utilizing alternative rates come next year. The announcement from the UK Financial Conduct Authority in 2017 on the cessation of LIBOR has triggered the acceleration of this transition, which led to the commencement of alternative benchmark rates, such as the secured overnight financing rate, the SOFR, the sterling overnight index average, and the euro short-term rate as a LIBOR replacement to develop market liquidity. The complex transition will be one to watch globally, as the question of what a post-LIBOR world will look like has been a topic of much discussion among financial institutions, regulators, and in global financial markets generally. The Bank of England estimates that LIBOR rates determine the interest rates for an estimated $400 trillion of financial contracts, including bonds, securitizations, deposits, and of course, derivatives, which represent 90% of it. The global transition to alternative benchmark rates will take place with some understandable level of excitement and anxiousness, given its significance and impact. As Standard Chartered Sadiq stated in the IIFM's white paper on this very good topic on global benchmark rate reforms published in March this year, this is a seismic shift for financial markets, as LIBOR is one of the most widely used benchmarks in global financial markets, and its discontinuation and identified replacements may raise certain issues and challenges for Islamic financial transactions, as we will expect a gradual phase out of the use of LIBOR among market players well ahead of this coming year end. Ladies and gentlemen, what will this transition mean for the Islamic finance industry and its future? For Sharia-compliant finance professionals, we take solace in participating in the financial markets in conformity with our Islamic faith and avoiding riba and excessive uncertainty in form of error. Over the decades, the development of the Islamic finance industry has quickly risen to the global stage to showcase its ability to meet market demands in line with Sharia principles and ethical approach, with about 68% of Islamic financial assets held within the banking industry, which is the main contributor to the market, all the while remaining resilient in the face of any market developments and volatility. The acceleration of its internationalization has deepened the linkages between different jurisdictions and further enhanced the economic integration between emerging economies. Throughout the years, the Islamic finance industry has developed significantly in tandem with the usage of the current LIBOR benchmark, which we are all familiar with. And I would like to say that learned Sharia scholars, as you've heard earlier, have also validated it as a mere benchmark for Islamic finance transactions, given its forward-looking rate that enables the profit mark to be calculated at the start of the contract itself. According to Fitch Ratings, about 70% of its rated Islamic banks use Sharia-compliant derivatives, otherwise known as tahawut, such as profit rate swaps and currency forward contracts, often linked to LIBOR. The recent success of the Islamic Development Bank in issuing its debut SOFR-linked sukuk under its recently updated 25 billion trust certificate issuance program reflects their commitment to the LIBOR transition. We anticipate more financial institutions will adopt this innovation across the global capital market. Having said that, does this mean a transition to risk-free rate benchmark will potentially enhance the Islamic finance operating environment? Will the adoption of the alternative benchmark rates hit a stumbling block among prospective investors? How will Islamic hedging work with the new reference rates? How will the shift to the risk-free rate affect the growth and progress of the overall industry, given its backward-looking nature? These are questions for our panelists to discuss today. Ladies and gentlemen, while the imminent transition away from the LIBOR will certainly pose a unique set of challenges to the Islamic finance industry as a whole, this could be a great opportunity for all of us to work together to find a workable Sharia solution that will ensure robust Islamic product structures, transactions, documentation, accounting and profitability, credit, as well as legal matters. This will allow the industry to innovate further and deeper on the back of this global benchmark transition. For those who have been following the developments in the industry in the past decade, you will recall the discussions surrounding the possibility of establishing a new alternative Islamic benchmark rate, where the Islamic banks can benefit from immensely and reduce their reliance on alternative conventional rates. The situation we are facing today calls upon us to further develop the Islamic financial markets globally, to be equipped with deeper Islamic money market instruments and an Islamic benchmark yield curve. At the risk of stealing the spotlight away from my colleague Hisham, who will be presenting the IILM's experience, I will let him take us through the IILM's journey and explore the possibility for an Islamic benchmark rate. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, ever since the discussion on the shift to a new benchmark rate began a few years ago, the questions I raised earlier are just some of the many questions the industry leaders and experts have been grappling with. I hope with today's virtual seminar, the speakers are able to help shed light on the way forward. Once again, I'm indeed grateful to Bank Indonesia and the IIFM for making today's event a reality. And I'm certain that by the end of the day, the audience will have a greater clarity on the phasing out of the LIBOR benchmark and the start of a new era for the Islamic finance industry. We hope you will enjoy today's session. Have a pleasant afternoon ahead. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much, Dr. Umar, for this well-taught speech. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, this is the time we are all waiting for. It is my honor and privilege to invite Her Excellency, Mr. Destri Damayanti, Senior Deputy Governor, Bank Indonesia, to deliver the keynote address. Silakan, Dr. Destri.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Honorable Mr. Nick Muhammad bin Nick Musa, Director General of Labuan Financial Services Authority, Vice Chairman, International Islamic Financial Market, or IIFM, Honorable Board of Directors of IIFM, Honorable Mr. Ijlal Ahmed Alfi, CEO IIFM, Honorable Dr. Umar Usaini, CEO of International Islamic Liquidity Management, and honorable speakers and all participants. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good afternoon to all of us. First of all, let us praise Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala for His blessing and mercy, so we can get together in this very significant seminar in good health. My peace and blessings always be upon our Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who has brought us out of the dark age into the light. It is both a pleasure and an honor for me to be here today among distinguished speakers and enthusiastic audiences. And let me first thank to you all, to the International Islamic Financial Market, or IIFM, and International Islamic Liquidity Management for providing excellent support to the success of this event in the middle of Bank Indonesia annual flagship event, which is Indonesia Syariah Economic Festival, or ISEF. Against the backdrop of increasingly challenging global environment due to COVID-19 pandemic, this seminar is a strategic avenue to enhance our common understanding on the situation that we are all currently facing with, and possibly to discuss some strategies to benefit from them in developing the global Islamic financial markets. I'm delighted to address the keynote of IIFM, IILM joint seminar, which will discuss about global benchmark rate reforms, challenges and solutions for Islamic finance industry. And I think this topic is timely and relevant as one of key strategies in developing Islamic financial market since London Interbank Offered Rate or LIBOR would cease immediately by the end of this year. Thus, I hope during this seminar, we can all broaden our insights and are encouraged to foster more cooperation and collaboration related with global benchmark rate reform, especially in Islamic financial market. Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently facing global economic recovery, yet we need to still cautious with the risk emanated from of COVID-19 pandemic impact and disruption of global value chain. As reported in the World Economic Outlook, October 2021, IMF projected global economic growth of 5.9% in the year of 2021. And this is lower 0.1% from their outlook in July 2021. And the growth will be moderation to 4.9% in the year of 2022. And revised lower projection in the year of 2021 indicates that there has been lower growth in advanced economies due to supply chain disruption and also in low-income developing countries due to worsening pandemic dynamic. However, the prospect of global growth is supported by the strengthened short-term prospect for commodity exports-oriented countries from emerging market and developing economies. And in the global financial market, the monetary policy outlook remains dovish, as most of central banks have maintained low interest rate to support economic recovery. And the imminent risk in the financial market cases to continue due to recent Evergrande debt crisis in China as one of global leading economies. With those factors, repricing the risk investment appetite and financial asset valuation by investors may generate a shifting of global portfolio flows. We see more challenging economic environment in the near future. Nevertheless, the situation also offers more opportunities in the context of Islamic finance development. We believe that there will be increasing need of safer and more stable instruments, including Islamic financial products, in time of rising uncertainty. Islamic financial market demonstrated a stronger resiliency based on the experience of previous global financial crises. It is due to Islamic finance practice related to the real sector, avoiding interest-based and speculative-based transactions. And because of the fact, we believe that Islamic finance has continued to become new frontier and offer more prospective financial model in this challenging global economic landscape. And in the midst of global economic recovery, the performance of Islamic financial market is delightful. Islamic capital and money market, driven by sukuk grow rapidly in a number of jurisdictions. Until recently, there have been several countries, as those in Europe and Asia, dedicatedly reviewed their legislation and tax regime in order to offer sukuk and develop the Islamic sukuk market. As a result, some of the sukuk were issued in multi-currencies for tapping a wider investor base and to finance variety of government and private projects. And based on recent IIFM sukuk report, it is found that the global sukuk issuance has reached 174 billion US dollar in the year of 2020, with sukuk outstanding reaching 648 billion US dollar, and this year's total sukuk issuance is the highest value of yearly sukuk issuance to date, with the growth of 19.8%. And in line with that, Islamic Financial Services Board, or IIFSB, Stability Report 2021 revealed that the global Islamic financial industry assets have also gone up to 2.4 trillion US dollar by the end of 2020 and increased by 10.7% year-on-year basis. In Indonesia, the development of Islamic finance continues even during the pandemic time. In 2020, total Islamic banking credit was able to grow by 8%, higher than conventional banks, which experienced a contraction of 4% year-on-year. In terms of government sukuk issuance, it also continues to increase, where last year's sukuk issuance was recorded at 367 trillion rupiah, or increased by more than 42% compared with year 2019. These various indicators show that the Indonesian Islamic finance industry can continue to grow and also has good resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, over the last few years, regulators across the globe have encouraged firms to shift away from using the LIBOR and switch to alternative overnight risk-free rates, or RFRs. This is a seismic shift for financial market, as LIBOR is one of the most widely used benchmark in global financial market, underpinning an estimated 400 trillion US dollar of financial contracts quoted across 5 currencies and 7 maturities: overnight, 1 week, and 1, 2, 3, 6, and 12 months. Hence, we are in the view that the discontinuation of LIBOR will have impacts on the global Islamic financial transaction that predominantly benchmark to LIBOR. And recently, IIFM, as one of international standard setting body for Islamic finance, has just launched practical Sharia compliant solutions for new benchmark risk-free rate for Islamic financing and hedging transactions, aiming to maintain Islamic financial industry's competitiveness in the absence of mainstream LIBOR benchmark rate at the end of this year. This is such a masterpiece for IIFM in collaboration with IIFM members, Sharia scholars, and key players of Islamic finance industry. And for that reason, I would like to appreciate and congratulate IIFM along with the working group project streams for accomplishing this important milestone. This is breakthrough Sharia compliant benchmark risk-free rate will be a central focus of this seminar. And this conference deliberates the impact of the transition from LIBOR and other interbank offer rates or IBORs to RFRs on Islamic banking transaction in a number of areas such as documentation, legal contract, profitability, accounting, risk, and regulation. International cooperation for development of Islamic financial industry is important in the midst of rising global uncertainties to maintain vibrant liquidity in the Islamic financial market, to strengthen intermediation of Islamic banking at the global level. A part of IIFM's impressive role in an effort to standardize the Islamic capital and money market documentation, role of international Islamic liquidity management, or IILM, it's also important to enhance liquidity management in Islamic financial institutions through periodic issuance of short-term Sharia compliant financial instrument. And with its unique business model, the IILM opens the possibility for the Islamic financial institution either to invest in Islamic liquidity instrument or to issue the global sovereign sukuk in a broader market and more efficient way. And by doing so, it will open opportunities for countries to enhance foreign direct investment that contributes to the real economic growth. Within Indonesian context, the Indonesian Authority in Banking and Finance sector, namely Bank Indonesia, and also Indonesian FSA or OJK, and Ministry of Finance have cooperatively had some efforts to deepen the Indonesian Islamic financial market, especially for sukuk and Islamic money market through Islamic financial market development framework. And related to this, our close cooperation, Bank Indonesia has significant role to promote Islamic money market development. And this is in line with one of our strategic pillars, Islamic financial market deepening for Islamic economy and finance development in Indonesia in achieving our vision to be a global Sharia economic and finance center of excellence. So far, Bank Indonesia has provided monetary instrument for Islamic money market, such as Sukuk Bank Indonesia, term deposit FX, wakalah facilities, and repo facilities for liquidity management. And not only instrument for commercial purposes, but also for social purposes, as Bank Indonesia, Ministry of Finance, Indonesian Wakaf Board, and Ministry of Religious Affairs have collaborated and initiated to launch Kas Wakaf Link Sukuk as one of the first instrument of sovereign sukuk linked to wakaf in the world. And we do hope that we can hand-in-hand cooperation to support developing Islamic economy and finance at global level. And ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, Bank Indonesia, as one of the founding members of IIFM and shareholders of IILM, would like to point out our efforts to fully support Islamic financial industry in the midst of ongoing global economic recovery. I also urge all the main standard setting organizations to collaborate and come up with more practical Sharia compliant solutions to cater the economic and financial needs of the Ummah. I believe that all we do will be our legacy as path to promote financial stability and support sustainability in the economic development to deliver more prosperity in our economy. As we go ahead, we need to ponder on how to fulfill the ideal aspiration of Islamic finance. Ideally, salient characteristic of Islamic finance to require a close link between real sector activities and financial market has positioned Islamic finance to be well anchored in servicing the real economy. And this is manifested into broadening strong production base, unemployment reduction, and greater inclusion of economic development. With pro-growth, pro-poor, and financial stability characteristic, an internationalization of Islamic finance may unleash country true economic growth potential, and this should be the ideal benchmark rate for Islamic financial transaction in the future. And finally, please allow me to express my sincere appreciation to all committee, event organizers, and parties for arranging this important and useful seminar. My appreciation and sincere gratitude also to distinguished speakers for their willingness to share their expertise and knowledge for the betterment of Islamic financial industry. May Allah Almighty bestow us the strength and patience to persevere in fulfilling our duty for a better future. Thank you very much, and I wish you all very successful and fruitful deliberation in today's seminar. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for this very inspiring, educating, and well appreciated keynote address. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Distinguished participants, this is the time you are waiting for. So I will advise each one of us to get a cup of black coffee in order to help us, awaken, because the discussion will be very, very intense and beautiful, inshallah. So today's seminar contains two sessions. First by IIFM, and it will be on the introduction to IBO and transition to RFR. And the second session by IILM, and it will be on potential for an Islamic benchmark rate, the IILM Sukuk experience. So the first session will commence now, and I will hand over the mic to my dear brother, Haji Kurram. So over to you, or Mr. Ijlal, I think, Haji Kurram. So over to you.
जी बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम अस्सलाम वालेकुम वरहमतुल्लाहि वबरकातुहू। Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa man wala amma ba'd. Jazakallah khair, thank you very much. Your Excellencies, respected panel members, distinguished guests, Jazakallah khair, thank you very much for inviting me to this very important event. First and foremost, I wanted to just confirm if I'm audible to the audience. If you can just give me a thumbs up. Okay, great, thank you. So, Jazakallah khair, I'm so honored to be here and extremely pleased also. I remember almost 2 years back, sometime in 2019, it was almost around the same time, third quarter, I would say, that I reached out to Brother Ijlal and I picked up this subject with him of IBOR transition. And I said, Brother Ijlal, this is, we had the IIFM board meeting coming up in December. And I reached out and I said, it's very important that we bring up this subject at the board meeting and start working on this initiative because it is a massive change that's happening in the global financial industry, and it's eventually going to come and hit the Islamic banking industry as well. And IIFM is to me the only institution that can play the role of bringing the industry together and working out a solution to this challenge. So I'm grateful, alhamdulillah, that the journey that we started almost 2 years back has come to an end, and mashallah, IIFM has done a great job of bringing the industry together and working on this very important initiative, and alhamdulillah, coming out with solutions which not only address the regulatory requirements, but do it in a very practical manner. And that's really the forte. When I compare IIFM with other industry bodies, I've always recognized and praised the fact that the solutions developed by IIFM are very practical. And I think that it's to go with how they conduct their consultations, how they conduct their working group. So a lot of credit to the IIFM team. I'll request the admin if they can display the slides. I had a few slides that I put together for this session. Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much. If we can go on to the next slide. So what we've seen is over the last few years, major regulators across the globe have been actively encouraging banks and financial institutions to shift away from LIBOR and to move towards the new rates. We can call them alternative reference rates. You can call them risk-free rates. They're known by different names. And this is a massive, massive change in the global financial industry, as was also earlier mentioned by Dr. Omar. There's a $400 trillion of financial contracts globally which are referenced to LIBOR. So imagine to go and rewire the global financial system to work with something else is a massive, massive change and requires huge amount of efforts from stakeholders across the financial system, which includes financial institutions, which includes the regulators, which includes industry bodies, which includes obviously the customers which are impacted by this change. So naturally, Islamic banking as an industry and Islamic financial institutions are also a citizen of the same financial system and are impacted by this change. But I'm very glad that the industry took note of this change at the right time and got engaged and put their heads together and worked out a solution that alhamdulillah now has been rolled out by IIFM, which addresses this challenge. Can we move to the next slide? So I think it is very important for us to understand what went wrong with the LIBOR, because if we don't learn from our mistakes, there is a risk that you may end up repeating these mistakes. So in essence, what had happened was post the financial crisis of 2008, a lot of regulatory changes, a lot of intervention was done by the government and the regulators to address the challenges that they kind of found in 2008 financial crisis. And one of the impacts of that was that the capital requirements around how the banks have to manage their capital were modified, which in effect kind of dried up the unsecured interbank lending market. So the volume of transactions happening in the unsecured interbank lending market in the global financial system, they started declining because there was less of an incentive for the banks to use that route for gaining liquidity. And what that did was that LIBOR in effect was based on these underlying transactions. So how was LIBOR calculated? It was essentially, they call it a trimmed average. It was a trimmed average of actual transactions, which were conducted by panel banks, which were sort of authorized to submit data or their averages of the LIBOR. But the initiative, the design did allow, where the volumes went down, for expert judgment to be brought into the process. So the panel banks could also exercise their own judgment. And when you say panel banks, it means individuals in those banks who were sitting in powerful positions to quote those rates. They were then increasingly exercising expert judgment or individual judgment on what they thought the right LIBOR should be. And this was something that was being done across 5 currencies and across 7 tenors. So LIBOR, if you recall, had overnight, 1 week, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. So there are multiple tenors that are getting impacted. Now, obviously, when you give individuals the discretion to decide what the rate should be on which trillions of dollars of financial transactions are happening, that leaves a door open for potential conduct risk, because a huge amount of numbers at stake, transactions at stake. And therefore, we unfortunately saw a number of high-profile rate manipulation cases which were brought up, and it really shook the financial system to its core. It was really an embarrassing moment for the whole financial sector, and a lot of loss of confidence happened as a result. Substantial amount of fines were dished out by the regulators to the banks which were involved in these activities. But what it did was that it created this, it initiated this dialogue, which was already happening as the volumes were coming out, that regulators were increasingly saying that this LIBOR rate is not really reflective of what's happening in the market. And the banks also were complaining about that the model needs to change. But then when these rate rigging scandals started coming up, I think it just accelerated this thought process that we need to move on to a different format, a different model through which we can calculate these benchmark rates. Next slide, please. So in 2017, the FCA, which is a UK regulator, they came out with an announcement that they will no longer be compelling panel banks to submit LIBOR rates after 2021. And there was almost simultaneous kind of movement across the Atlantic, and with other regulators also who came out with similar announcement. And this sort of exercise of creating the alternative reference rates was accelerated. So the key 5 jurisdictions which are have the biggest impact in the financial system globally, they started forming working committees to work on these alternative reference rates, and Financial Services Board was delegated this responsibility by the world leaders at the G20 level. And eventually it resulted in the creation of these various rates that you see listed on the screen. Secured overnight financing rate, SOFR for USD, reformed sterling overnight index average, SONIA for GBP, and similar rates that you see for other currencies. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what is the key difference between LIBOR or these new reference rates or the risk-free rates? And I think it is very important for us to understand in order for us to be able to derive the impact that it has on the Islamic financial structures. So I think first and foremost, the biggest impact that the biggest difference between LIBOR and the RFR rates is that the LIBOR used a forward-looking term structure where when you're entering into a transaction, so today is 26th of October, if you're entering into a 6-month contract with the customer, you would know today, let's say if a bank is giving financing to a customer for 6 months, you would know today the rate for the next 6 months. You can have a 6-month rate that you can agree with the customer. In the case of RFRs, these are all overnight rates. So you do not have a tenor rates in the original construct of the RFRs. Now, derivatives or derived rates from these overnight rates are being developed, and my fellow panelist brother Mustafa Adil probably also be touching upon that in his presentation, inshallah. But the principal construct of the RFR rates is that these are overnight rates. So what that does is that if, let's say, in a financial transaction, you have to calculate profit every month, every 3 months, every 6 months. So at the start of the facility, you don't know what the pricing for the 6 month is. You don't know what the pricing for the 3 months is. And therefore, you have to wait till the end of the pricing period. Let's say it's a quarterly repricing. So you have to wait till the end of the quarter to look back at the daily rates over the last 90, 91, 92 days, and then determine the profit or the interest for the quarter under discussion, right? So it is a look back based rate as opposed to a forward looking rate that LIBOR used to be. And that poses a significant challenge for Islamic finance contracts in the manner in which they're structured. And we have a slide where we'll talk about what that impact is. The second impact that it had was that the existing contracts. So the other key difference that we have to be mindful of is, as we said, LIBOR was a massive amount of financial contracts globally which were referencing LIBOR. So now when you make a cutover and transition to the new reference rates, there is an adjustment required to the existing contract. So LIBOR in effect was a rate that factored in credit premium, whereas the risk-free rates or the RFR rates are a proxy of risk-free rates. So essentially, they don't have any credit premium in them. So what that means is that when the transition from LIBOR to RFR happens, there has to be a credit adjustment spread. So you have to adjust the pricing of existing contracts which were executed prior to the transition date. So there are different cutover dates for different currencies and different tenors, but any financial transaction, let's say somebody enter into a 5-year term loan or a term finance facility in 2019. Now this loan is going to mature beyond the December 2021 cutover. So for this transaction, you need to enter into a negotiation with the customer and reprice their facility and add a credit adjustment spread. And that's something that obviously needs to be determined. A lot of work has happened in the conventional industry on how that credit adjustment spread is to be determined. We will just touch base on that in the next slide. The other obviously difference is that, as we said, LIBOR lost touch with the reality. So the rates that were being published were not based on actual underlying transaction. So that is something that is been addressed in the RFR methodology, that RFR is based on actual transactions happening in liquid markets. Can you move on to the next slide? Yes. So I think the key impact here is that when you reference a LIBOR or any benchmark rate in a floating rate instrument, like we have Ijara and an Islamic finance contract, or if you have a floating rate term loan in the conventional sense, you need to take some kind of an average of the overnight rate, because you can't use a daily rate and you can't change the rate every day, right? And this is where the challenge arises, that how do you do that adjustment? So that raises the process of coming up with a compounded methodology, and this is another Sharia structuring challenge. And we found in our dialogue with the industry players and Sharia scholars that there was a strong kind of reaction to the notion that we will be using compounding as a concept in Islamic methodology, and I think it took a while for us to take the industry stakeholders through the process, making them understand that the compounding methodology being used here is only as a reference, as a benchmark. The underlying financial contract would still continue to follow the guidelines of Sharia. It will still continue to follow the requirement that the principal under the transaction should never be compounded, should never be increased over transaction. I think that has been very neatly addressed in the solution paper and the pronouncement that came out from IIFM. I've already talked about the credit spread adjustment issue, so I'm not going to deliberate on that further. But I think the major sort of discussion that happened in the industry was around how the credit spread adjustment will be calculated, and where the industry has mostly kind of settled on is using a 5-year average historical median of the spread, the difference between the IBOR and the RFR rates calculated on a look back basis over the last 5 years. That is the methodology that ISDA has used in developing their credit adjustment spread, and the same methodology has also been endorsed by the ARRC and the RFR working group in US and UK. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the challenges for Islamic finance contracts? So how does this impact Islamic finance contracts? Next slide. So let's first talk about the fact that the RFR methodology, as we said, involves calculating the impact of the daily movement on an areas basis, on a look back basis. So there are different methodologies that are used in the conventional space to address this challenge. One is what we call the payment delay, which is that the RFR used over a current period. So basically, let's take a practical example. If you have a contract that has quarterly rate fixing, right? Let's say you have 5-year term finance. The profit or the rate is to be fixed every quarter. So what would happen is that you will give the customer a certain time period at the end of each quarter to make the payment of profit. So let's say you're calculating the profit from 1st of January to 31st of March. So you will give customer additional 5 days to pay the profit for the previous quarter. That methodology is called payment delay. The second methodology is called lockout or suspension period. And in this methodology, you basically use the average RFR over the current calculation period with the last overnight rate set at the level of RFR rate fixed, certain days before the period ends. So in the same example, you could basically, from 1st of January, you start counting the rate, and 25th of March, which is 5 days. I'm just giving hypothetical examples here. The actual calculation happens on a business day basis. Or let's say on 25th of March, you will cease the rate calculation calculation, lock in the rate, and say, let the customer be informed that the profit payment for this quarter is this much. It gives the customer 5 days to make payment, and by 31st of March he has to make the payment. And the last and the most important, I would say, because in reality, as we see the discussions happening in the industry, this last option of look back is considered to be the most favorable and most viable option, which is being adopted by the industry, which is that the profit calculation period can reference a rate with a lag. So let's say if you're starting the profit calculation period from 1st of January to 31st of March, the rate that it references can be the rate 5 days before 1st of January. So let's say 25th of December, 24th of December, depending on business days, you can have a 5-day look back period. So the profit for 1st of January is calculated using the rate on 25th of December, so on and so forth. So at any point in time, the customer has 5 days advance notice of how the rate calculation will work. So I'm getting a bit technical here, but this is just to explain to participants. Mashallah, we have a huge list of participants here. Many of them would be, involved in constructing contracts or constructing products. So I'm wearing my product development hat here and just sort of getting into a bit of details here. So now what impact it has? So the impact that it has on the Islamic finance contract, as we all know, the most widely used Islamic finance contracts are Murabaha, which is a buy and sale contract. You buy something, you sell something to the customer. And what Sharia requires is at the point of sale, at the point of aqd, at the point of ijab qabul, you have to fix the price. You have to fix the price. So if I'm selling something to a customer, payment has to be done in 6 months' time. I have to now, today at the point of disbursement, lock in my profit amount in dollar terms. And therefore, it is a challenge because in the RFR world, you don't have a 6-month rate. You only have the overnight rate. I can tell you the rate for today or yesterday, but I cannot tell you the rate for the next 6 months. And that raises huge challenges from a structuring perspective for Islamic finance. If you look at ijara or similar structures like diminishing musharaka, you have a similar challenge. Because even in an ijara contract, what Sharia requires is before the commencement of the ijara period, the ijara amount or the rental value in dollar terms must be agreed between the parties. And therefore, you have the exact same challenge. If I sign the contract on 1st of January, the rental period is every quarter. I do not know the rate for the quarter to allow me to calculate the rental amount for the quarter. So this is the key impact that we kind of identified for Islamic finance contract, and it was a difficult riddle to solve. And we looked at some 7-8 structures together in the working committee. A lot of banks came and gave their suggestions. Alhamdulillah, I'm glad that the solutions that we kind of agreed on are something that the industry agreed are viable structures that help our customers. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, and this is my second last slide. So for the organizers, if they're watching the clock, I'm trying to wrap up here. The impact on Islamic hedging products. So let's talk about what's the impact on the Islamic hedging products. So obviously in the conventional space, this is much more organized. This is obviously they have bigger longevity than us. So ISDA released the fallback provisions back in January 2021. And this is supplement 70, which provides the provisions for IBOR fallback language. And Islamic hedging documents, as we all know, use either the IIFM Tahawut document, or some institutions use their bespoke documents. And therefore, there was this issue that we cannot just plug and play the ISDA language, and something had to be done. And this is something that inshallah Brother Ijlal will be talking about in his presentation, how we are addressing the impact for the Tahawut documentation. Can we move on to the next slide? So what impact does it have on the financing products, and how do we address this? So as we talked about, the challenge with the financing contracts is the unavailability of the tenor rates at the start of the facility, and therefore the fundamental design of the Islamic structure had to be looked at. Now, obviously, we all know since this conversation started, there have been positive developments on the term rates front, and I'll leave that for Brother Mustafa to cover. But we must all recognize that in the new world, we will constantly see ourselves facing two types of rates. So there will be certain products and structures and contracts which will be using overnight rates, and there will be other transactions where there will be a preference for term rates. So where there is use of overnight rates, obviously that raises the Sharia challenge that I just talked about. So the two key areas of impact in the financing transactions is obviously inclusion of fallback provisions. So where you have an existing contract which is running, you need to introduce fallback language that when the transition happens, how will the existing contract get converted? How will the existing contract operate under the new provisions? And secondly, we need to modify the core Sharia structure to allow it to work with the overnight rates. Last slide, please. Yeah, so just wrapping up here. So I think, as I said earlier, IFM has played a very important role, and I'm really grateful to Brother Jalal, Dr. Ahmed, for really taking charge of the situation, bringing the industry together. We had more than 55 banks, if I'm not, or participants, if I'm not mistaken, in the working committee. This included banks, this included lawyers, this included Sharia scholars and other members of the Islamic finance ecosystem. We all came together, put our thinking caps on and came up with these solutions. And what is very important to also recognize is that not only do these solutions address the current IBOR transition regulatory requirement, but it also addressed a massive impact that some of the Middle Eastern countries are facing by the issuance of the IOFI Standard 59. So what we made sure was that these new structures are designed in such a way that they also meet the requirements of the IOFI Standard 59, which is a very challenging regulation to comply with, and some of the countries in the Middle East had really been struggling with. But with these solutions coming out, it addresses that gap, and it helps the industry meet that challenge as well. I would really, in the end, urge the Islamic finance industry to benefit from these solutions that IFM has published and adopt them in their institutions. It will be a pity if, as an institution, we insist on using a different structure or a homegrown or a house structure, because when we are in the market, especially in syndication style facilities, it is extremely challenging to convince the customer that whether this structure is right or that structure is right. Alhamdulillah, we can all rely on these solutions that IFM has developed, and it saves and makes the process very efficient for everyone involved in the transaction. Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much. I will be available throughout the session. So if there are any questions that anyone wants to pose through the Q&A link at the bottom, they can pose the question. I'll be happy to answer. Jazakallah khair. Thank you.
Jazakallahu khairan, my Akhi Haj Kurram, for this excellent presentation and introduction and information. Now, the second speaker is Brother Mustafa Adil. Brother Mustafa is well known in the industry. Brother Mustafa, we know him with vast knowledge and experience in Islamic banking, transactions, and structures for many years. And he's now, as you can see, the head of Islamic finance at London Stock Exchange Group. So I will not take long time to introduce him because he's well known in the industry, Brother Mustafa. So over to you, Brother Mustafa.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed, for that very kind introduction. And my thanks to all the organizers for arranging this very, very important webinar to tackle what is going to be one of the key challenges for the Islamic finance industry as the global financial industry transitions away from the historic LIBOR rates and onto the new risk-free rate regime. And Brother Khurram very comprehensively covered why the transition is taking place, what is the need for us to move away from the LIBOR rates, what were some of the limitations of that, what the new infrastructure is going to look like, what is the concept driving the development of these risk-free rates, and also what are the implications for the Islamic finance industry. And I think in my presentation, I will very briefly touch upon some of the administrators, some of the jurisdictions, and the different approaches that they're taking to the implementation of the risk-free rates, and also talk about how the global transition is taking place, how much adoption is taking place, and where we are with that. I've prepared a brief presentation, which if the organizers can share, and as mentioned, we'll talk about these different challenges. So if we move to the first slide, I've provided an overview of where we sit on that. If you can move to the first slide, please. So I've provided a high-level overview of where the industry sits in terms of what they're developing and how they're adopting. So the previous LIBOR rate was calculated by a single agency, administered by the FCA and managed by the ICE benchmark administrator. And they would issue, as Brother Khurram mentioned, LIBOR rates for 5 different currencies: USD, GBP, Euro, Swiss franc, and Japanese yen, and they would issue it across 7 different tenors. And this was primarily done based on contributions from the contributing banks for these rates, and very widely used in the industry. The transition away now towards the risk-free rates is primarily to move away from any subjectivity, any manipulation, any overdue influence of some of these institutions, to be based on actual transactions. And these transactions primarily being driven from the overnight deposit market with these institutions, which are considered risk-free. So one of the biggest changes is going to happen is you're going to go from a single administrator, which was the FCA, to multiple regulators. So in the US, you have the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. In the UK, it is Bank of England, and the various other institutions in the other markets that will be administrating these rates. All of these institutions have set up working groups, and each of the working groups have created the underlying risk-free rate, SOFRA for the US, SONIA for the UK, and others. And at the same time, they are also administrating the compounded rate, which, as Brother Khudra mentioned, was the backward-looking rate to provide what was the compounding rate for, let's say, 1 week tenor, 1 month tenor, 3 months tenor, and so on. Now, each of these regulators is also assigning institutions in the private sector to be administrators for the term rates, which are the forward-looking rates. And across the board, the primary structure of how these term rates works is very, very similar. What happens is that they take the underlying risk-free rate as the benchmark rate, or the benchmark in that calculation, and they utilize OIS transactions that are taking place in the derivatives markets for those currencies and link them up. So if you have OIS transactions going forward 3 months trading at a particular rate, and you have the risk-free rate, that is the actual rate based on transactions today. You apply a formula linking them together to project what the market expects the rate to be 3 years from now, or the compounded rate to be three months from now, sorry, or 1 month from now, or 1 week from now, and so on, right? So the idea here is to move as far away from the contribution quotation system and as much to real transactions as possible. And that is something that is consistent across all the different risk-free term rate administrators. The other thing that I should mention, which is important, is that while the vast majority of jurisdictions are adopting full migration to RFR, some jurisdictions are adopting what is called the dual curve approach. So for example, in the US, you have full migration. So you have to adopt either the overnight risk-free rate, the compounded backward-looking risk-free rate, or the approved term rate, which is being calculated by the CME group for the US, for the SOFRA. And all contracts have to reference one of these rates as the benchmark rate. This is a requirement going forward. Similarly, in the UK, they have to either adopt the SONIA rate, the backward-looking SONIA, or the term SONIA. But in the UK, the difference is that the UK has given multiple institutions the ability to calculate these rates. So ICE is a calculator for this benchmark rate. FTSE Russell is a calculator for this benchmark rate. Refinitiv is a calculator for this benchmark rate. And the market can use whichever benchmark provider that is quoting the rates to be quoted within their contracts, but it has to be linked to this. In Europe, for example, the European Central Bank has taken a different approach. They're taking the dual approach. So they have specified that certain contracts have to quote either the overnight or the backward-looking European short-term rate, the ESTRA. However, for forward-looking contracts, and that they've placed certain restrictions on what contracts can adopt them, they can use the EBOR rate, the Euribor rate that is being calculated by EMMI, the European Money Market Institute, and that is a contribution-based rate, but with lots of revisions in the methodology that were conducted back in 2019 to make sure that it minimizes any kind of manipulation or misuse of the rate as was experienced in prior years. So they have tightened up their methodology, and they are calculating this rate through EMMI and making it available to be quoted for certain markets and jurisdictions. What is also interesting is that outside of the existing currencies that were quoted in LIBOR, you have other institutions like Singapore, like Hong Kong, like Australia, like Canada, that are also developing risk-free rates and backward-looking risk-free rates. So there is a broader acceptance within the market that the industry or the institute or the broader financial services industry recognizes the value of risk-free rates, and even entities that are not impacted by LIBOR are transitioning away from their IBOR contribution rates and developing risk-free rate frameworks along the lines of what is being developed by the 5 regulators for the RFRs mentioned here. If we move to the next slide, now a lot has happened in the last 1 year, and a lot is going to happen in the next few years. So there's a lot of insights here, but I want to focus on a couple of very, very important ones. All the LIBOR rates, with the exception of US dollar LIBOR, are going to be terminated by the end of the year. So by the end of the year, the GBP, the Euro, the Japanese yen, and the Swiss franc are going to be terminated. They're not going to be required to be quoted any longer. And within the USD rates, the 1 week and the 2 month tenors are going to be discontinued. But the actual USD rates for 1 month, 3 month, 6 month, and 12 month are going to continue till mid of 2023. And the reason for this was when the working committee was developing these rates, they felt that there was not enough derivatives in the market to calculate an effective term rate at that point in time. And they felt that they need the risk-free rates and the backward-looking risk-free rates to be, present in the market for a longer period of time. They want depth in the derivatives market before they go and calculate these term rates and force institutions to base their contracts on those, right? The entire idea of this is to move away from contributions or quotations and move towards real transactions. In terms of advancement, the UK is the most advanced jurisdiction when it comes to transition to term risk-free rates. They, in fact, launched the term SONIA back in Q4 of last year. So there's been, a full year of term SONIA having been quoted and rolled out. And then you have different jurisdictions moving at different rates. The US jurisdiction has adopted a official policy of, ensuring the transition as soon as practicable. And what they mean by practicable is that they don't want to compromise on the depth of the transactions there when calculating these rates. They want to ensure that there is sufficient depth to make sure that the weaknesses of the previous LIBOR regime don't transition into the current ecosystem when it comes to the development of the risk-free rate regimes and its derived backward-looking and its derived term rates that are there. If we move to the next slide, which is the last slide, I just want to give everybody in the audience an overview of how we are moving with the implementation of this, right? So as I mentioned, the SONIA rate, which is the GBP rate, they're the most advanced. The rate has been there for more than a year now. And currently, 84% of the contracts that are being issued in the last quarter are all referencing SONIA, backward-looking SONIA, term SONIA. So there's a very, very successful transition, and they expect to close it out by the end of the year, and they're on track to achieve that. When it comes to SOFRA, again, because the US, due to practical reasons, had to push the issuance and the adoption of the term rate till 2023, that is reflected in the adoption. A number of contracts still quoting the existing LIBOR regime, but as a benchmark, but we expect that over time that is going to transition. And even though the quotation of the rates will stop in June 2023, the US regulators are slowly pushing transaction type by transaction type to the new rates. So you will see over the course of the next 2 years, it's not going to be a sudden switch off all in 2023. It's going to be a transition approach where different contracts are being instructed to then migrate to the new RFR body of rates away from the previous LIBOR. So they're going to slowly transition this, and we're going to see adoption increase over that time. For the European one, I mentioned, the Euribor that is calculated by EMMI is being widely quoted for different contracts that are being rolled out, and that is with the supervision of the European Central Bank. And then the Swiss rate and the yen rate are at different layers of implementation that are currently taking place. As another thing to mention is that with each jurisdiction having their own calculators for the term risk-free rates, they also have slightly different wordings as to how the fallback language is going to be implemented. And as Brother Khurram mentioned, ISDA has led the way for the fallback language for derivatives, and different jurisdictions are looking at the fallback language for the cash-based financing contracts and other contracts. And it's widely accepted that the way to adopt this is to project backwards the RFR rates, and then to look at the differential between LIBOR and the RFR rates to see what is the 5-year average spread, and that is going to be the calculation. So for example, if you have a 5-year contract that quotes LIBOR and it is, let's say, LIBOR plus 50 basis points as a reference, it's not going to be term RFR plus 50 basis points. You have to look at the fallback language to see what is the differentiator or the spread that has to be adopted as you transition from LIBOR to the risk-free rate or the term risk-free rates that you adopt. And that is something that IIFM has led in the working group and worked with ISDA and the industry stakeholders to develop language that is appropriate for the Islamic institutions. And I think that that's a major development that is going to help ease the transition of this ease the transition to the new risk-free rate regime. And what I would like to conclude with very, very quickly is that, through our discussions with the industry, as Brother Khurram highlighted as well, the industry recognizes that the term risk-free rate is the easiest transition, where you can replace LIBOR, you can put in a spread, and you can quote the the term risk-free rate, which is forward-looking. But many types of transactions and types of contracts are not going to adopt that model. The broader industry is going to utilize risk-free rates and backward-looking risk-free rates, and they're already putting in mechanisms like the delayed payment and other things to facilitate that. So for us to play a role in that, we have to have our own mechanisms where we are not excluded from those broader types of transactions or structures simply because of that. So the dual approach is the one that the industry needs to adopt, having a preference for term RFRs where applicable, but where not applicable, having appropriate contracts and structures that can utilize referencing the RFR or the backward-looking RFRs. And I think IIFM has done a great job in developing many of these that will definitely help the industry transition to that. That is the end of my presentation. I want to thank the organizers for giving me the time, and I will hand it back to Dr. Ahmed to move forward. And I'm here to respond to any questions that may come up during the course of the webinar.
Thank you very much, Brother Mustafa. As usual, mashallah, very wonderful presentation. We really appreciate and benefit really from it. Our third speaker is Mr. Ijlal. Mr. Ijlal is our third speaker. And do you know who is Mr. Ijlal? Mr. Ijlal is my boss. He is my boss. We all know Mr. Ijlal. Mr. Ijlal is the one who is leading the industry, and nobody can deny that, towards sustainable development through his positive and excellent leadership of IIFM. And the IIFM performance can justify that. May Allah bless him and his family. So I don't want to say much about Mr. Ijlal because we all know him. So I will hand over to him. Over to you, Abu Maham. Jazakallah khair.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalatu wassalamu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to all. It's really honored to be part of this forum today. And I'm really grateful to Bank Indonesia for hosting this event at ISEF and all IIFM board members and the panelists and all of you who joined. And thank you, Abu Ahmed, for the introduction, and really grateful, but it's all the collaboration. I think the main focus really, based on my experience and what we have seen in taking the industry forward, is the collaboration and working together. We cannot really work in isolation, or we can afford that one institution can drive. It's a collaborative effort, and it's the effort driven by some institutions, but others also, benefit, and they also, at times join. So I will just briefly, present certain things already been explained. And what I've seen is there are three main questions which has come, and I think the best would be that we will keep the questions at the end. So one question is, with others can also, the panelists can also point on that, is other transaction impacted by RFR, although I'll try to touch on that. difference we have explained, both Brother Khurram and Brother Mustafa, between the interbank offer rates and also risk-free rates or alternative benchmark rates as they are called. And what about the domestic rates? So there could be maybe some input on how the domestic rates would apply, and maybe some updates eventually will come. But these are the three questions which I have noted. So if you have any others, maybe that can be also included. So with that, inshallah, I will start with my presentation. So please, can you load that? So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So background we have all covered. I just wanted to highlight two things. One is, there are certain institutions which take a very leading role. So we acknowledge those in this, which are the core working group. It's always the case in this standardization efforts that we have the whole spectrum of institutions, in various roles they have to join and work together. We have seen also Ernst & Young, you can see also there, why I'm mentioning that there is an area on accounting side, which is something to be do with AOFI, and I'm sure they must be doing. So we all have our own sort of a role to play in these development. We have, our role to look at the documentation side and the solution side, which is the main focus of IIFM. But then there are others also, and of course the law firms and the institutions who drove. But like Brother Khurram mentioned, we had, if you can see from the consultative meeting, a number of participants we had, and given the present situation, everything is virtual, but Alhamdulillah, it's working well virtually, really, we have seen. So you can see the number of jurisdictions, institutions who participated. So there are many, many institutions who took some time active role, and sometime, they, were there to look at it, how it has been developed and how they can benefit an industry as a whole. So next slide. Of course, some of you may have joined first time, so I would just like to recommend that you look at the white paper, which was developed, and it have a lot of information. And now today what we have done is further re-emphasized what has been there, and also provided the update. And this is the first time after the publication of IIFM standard solutions for Ijara and Murabaha, that we are doing this event, and it's not a workshop type, so naturally we are not giving any any certificates, but we can hold that also. But this is for the wider market, whoever wants to join and see how this major global benchmark reforms are taking place, and also how industry we have to keep it abreast. And like Dr. Ahmed mentioned, Islamic rate is also very close to our heart. We really want to see that also, but you can see that there are many challenges, and this is not really the forum for me to discuss on that one, but we are part of the exercise and with the other infrastructure institutions to see what can be done in that regard, although timing some may say, but we have to see the reality, and we have to see what we are focusing is the cross-border market in particular, and the major currencies which is industry focus on. We have added few currencies which we have seen in our hedging side, which I will explain very briefly. It's the Singapore dollar, that is also something is taking place, and then we are Islamic has much less, I think, transactions for Aussie dollars, or maybe Hong Kong dollar is could be one, but these 5 currencies mainly are the one which most of the Islamic cross-border transactions happen. And we look at, as a whole, in terms of transaction types. So it could be syndication transactions, it could be the hedging transaction, and then, if you look at the work stream, what we formed were the 3 work streams after our consultation for the wider market. And these were, based on the recommendation of core working group, which I had earlier mentioned. And these were open, for many institutions who joined us. And we worked separately. Reason is has its own peculiarity. So we had to work for work stream for the financing side, which we have, alhamdulillah, came out with these standards, which I'll explain. And also we had on the hedging, which is a separate, work stream. And there is a work stream on Sukuk, And maybe our friend from IILM, Brother Hisham, may also mention, because Sukuk has a certain different element, use of IBOR or LIBOR in that case is not really, that much there. It's more, they use mid-swap, some other rates for Sukuk. So we are all also open to look at Sukuk, but the more urgent were the financing side and the hedging side. Next slide, please. I'm repeating this one, and with the permission of Brother Khurram, and because he presented that, and this is part of their contribution also in the beginning in the white paper. Reason why sort of I'm doing this is to further re-emphasize the question came, about the differences, and you can see, as explained, by other fellow panelists, that some transactions you can still use the risk-free rate, which is backward-looking, or which is spot rate. It doesn't have a tenor element in that. And that is, having said that, is one example could be the hedging segment, or in the conventional, the derivative market. They generally use, the spot rate. So there you don't really need to have a solution for, to, overcome the challenge of, risk-free rate, the way it is explained in this slide. So that's why what we are doing in the hedging segment, in which Habib will cover, would be looking at some documentation, amendment documentation, like mentioned, ISDA Supplement 70. As all of you may know, that we work for ISDA for many years, and we have a full set of library for hedging, including the master agreement, including the credit support deed, and also some product confirmations for key hedging instrument for Islamic finance, which are needed. So that's where we sort of, in the hedging segment, we are at the moment now, just for the update for all of you, is finished our working group, consultation, and we are now going to our Sharia board for their guidance. Of course, all IIFM standards are English, because generally that's the language being used, but we do translate into Arabic initially, which is being done, both for our Sharia and institutions. We use Arabic to better understand, and also some of our standards, even hedging, we have now some French translation also available, which we are, continuously trying to see as the, implementation of IIFM standards increases. And that's the main sort of thing which really, one subject which I would like to stress is really industry coming to, and also institution based in Indonesia, in particular others, to work and join IIFM and support us in our efforts. We cannot really do alone. Alhamdulillah, we are progressing, but it's still, I think, there is still, my hope is that we have, the whole, support of the greater, institution from all the, major jurisdictions which are active in Islamic finance. So that's where, why it's important to differentiate that for some products, which the question is there, which we will, I think I'll keep it for the end. You need solutions. And for some segment, you need some amendment documentation, which we are doing now. And our aim is to, before the December, some institution may already have the drafts who are part of our work streams. But generally for the institutions, inshallah, it will be available so that they can use them and have it implemented through their process of looking at the document before end of the year. So I think in the next month or so, inshallah, we would be able to, inshallah, complete that with also support and guidance of our IIFM Sharia board, which has a very experienced and a number of scholars which really are driving the industry and which support us also. Next slide. I think one of the key things which one has to see, and we also, it was mentioned in our vice chairman's speech as well, that using of the benchmark is something which one has to be very sort of see when the word compounding comes, or compounded in the industry. Generally there is a perception issue that, oh, compounding, how can Islamic and have a compounding? Of course, we don't have compounding in Islamic finance. In our transaction calculations, So you cannot add anything in the principal or profit, on compounded basis. But what we are talking about here, and which Brother Mustafa also mentioned, that these sort of, the rates, the way, the risk-free rate in some cases, Sonia or, so for what they are doing is they are coming out with the term rate by using compounding methodology. So these are still the benchmark, and that is what, we explain to and seek the guidance from our Sharia. And it is very clear that these are basically just the benchmark rates. So even the benchmark is, derived through the mechanism of compounding. Still, it is a benchmark. And it is like LIBOR, when, LIBOR could be in different tenors, as we know, I think about 6 tenors it had. So this is something which one has to be very mindful that here it is a benchmark and there is not an issue to use as a benchmark if it is, derived through the compounded methodology. Rate should be easily accessible. So that is something we all are very clear in Islamic finance. So when you are doing these transactions, and as I will explain also, and Brother Khurram also mentioned how, look back, methodology is used, how these rates would be, they should be visible. That's one of the guidance and explanation we have. And then, like I said, it's a benchmark. So when the transaction is agreed between the two parties, it will not give rise to any further increase in principal amount. So that is not the case. It is just the benchmark is used, and then it is the transaction is done through without any element of compounding in the calculation if we use. From Sharia point of view, the pricing methodology on Murahaba, offer and acceptance does not change due to adopting the risk-free benchmark rates for tenor I'm talking about. And similarly, Ijara, the exact rental pricing will be known to both parties as it currently practiced. So that is, when you have this benchmark, before the offer and acceptance, in some cases, because you cannot use the term rates in all cases, as been explained. That's why you need these solutions, which I have pushed these standard solutions for Ijara and for Murabaha. But then, if you know in some cases the tenor, let's say not all currencies have tenor rates at the moment, dollar is still being pushed. So there is still these solutions are very much needed for the industry as being highlighted. So next slide, please. And then we also always sort of IIFM, when we develop our standards, we use AOFI and other like International Fiqh Academy. If they have their rulings, we use it as a basis. So if you see both for the solutions, you will see our Sharia board has recommended relevant AOFI standards, which are there as the footnotes, and all our document standards have reference to AOFI or any relevant entity. It's generally AOFI, which is also based in Bahrain, of course, and we have a good understanding so that we don't duplicate our efforts, of course. So that is the basis of, especially between IIFM, FSB, and AOFI, that we all complement each other in the betterment of the industry. So AOFI standard 27, one should refer. In terms of indices, that is the benchmark, and that's very clear that these what the risk-free rates are based on those sort of standard. And then one point which is again re-emphasized here is about the these benchmarks are used mainly as a reference to arrive the profit amount. It is essentially for Muraba contract, where the exact profit amount relevant must be known to the parties. So that is where we are coming from in case of the benchmark. Next slide, please. Now coming to towards the solutions, and I'll briefly mention because there are more details which are of course available. We have our Sharia pronouncement for our members, and we always institution ask us sometimes. So IIFM is there to clarify certain things. So I will just mention, so they are pointing out that time is limited. So I will very quickly go into the, in terms of what we have done. So for Murabaha, and again, I think one point one has to understand that why we did based on our consultation is that I have 5 minutes, so inshallah I'll try to finish that, and then if there are questions and all, and later on we can inshallah do a more detailed workshop. So at the moment, what we have for Muraba, because that is where the syndicated Muraba and other Muraba transactions was needed, and we have two solutions. And the reason why our Sharia board also provide flexibility is looking at so covering giving institutions choice. So what they want to use, so they can use the dual tranche structure and single tranche structure in case of Muraba, and I'll briefly mention in my next slide, please. So in the dual tranche structure, there is one long dated Muraba. So that could be, let's say a 3-year or 5-year Muraba, for example, syndication, if you are taking, that mode of financing. And then you will have, so in that you will have Muraba, the principal amount, and you will have a rate you will include there, which could also provide the buffer. So in case of rising, the benchmark rate, or in case of maybe it can cover, it's up to the institutions how they want to, what they want to bring in there. Maybe they want to bring in the credit sensitiveness also element there. They can build that. So that is a long dated Murabaha, and that is done so for the entire period. So that will have one rate, and then naturally what will happen is, in the meanwhile, if you are using the risk-free rate, which is backward looking, and you're not using term rate, even term rate also you can use in this structure, then you can have agreed with the customer that you will have a spot Murabahas for each period. Let's say if it is a quarterly basis, then you'll have every quarter a risk-free rate Muraba for that element. So it will be just the risk-free rate element which was not previously built in, and then you will basically see that that's the actual, or if there is any. So there is no other cost to be added. So one has to be very careful in Islamic finance that we don't add any cost, time value of money, or these kind of things. So this is not something which we can bring in. And then the issue of in the Murabaha generally, specifically, you cannot have a bank can give assurance that it will give any discount or benefit to the customer. So that is any rebate specifically, it is up to the bank which it will like to give or not. So that is something which is one has to be clear. So the rebate is not guaranteed. Of course, if you go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So now we move to the variant 2, single Muraba and with 2 undertaking. And this particular one is, it's okay if I take maybe a few more minutes. I think that's fine. I will try to do that and wrap up, but we need to be clear, what I'm trying to explain. So, inshallah, all of you will not mind if I take a few more minutes. We are a little over time, but generally our discussion is alhamdulillah beneficial. So going into the single Murahaba with 2 undertaking, and that structure also generally used in Malaysian market as well for some time now, and it is something which is based on the ceiling structure. Sometimes there is a regulatory backing for certain solutions which is needed, and that's where they have the regulatory support there also. And this is a single Murabaha, which is a long dated Murabaha with a higher rate, and then the customer you agree with the commercial rate that would be lower, and then you have to bank also have to protect itself also, like customer undertaking, that if the contractual rate exceeds the commercial rate exceeds the contract rate, then naturally the customer will compensate the bank, or vice versa, the bank will also give undertaking like I said, rebate, which could be possible, because rebate is not obligatory, as we know from Sharia point of view, but it gives bank undertaking to the spot murabaha to pay the difference between the ceiling rate and contract rate. So this is one solution. And very quickly move to the next slide, please. And there, of course, more details. At the moment, time is not allowing me to go into further details. So these are two variants for the ijara. If you go to the next slide, please. Here in this variant is the daily rental, which is the case. So you have to have a good operational setup for this, for ijara transactions. And some banks do have developed their operational and all for, as we know, moving to the risk-free rates operationally. IT and all has played a role, and institutions and work together. Not only from legal point of view, we had or accounting, we have IT side also, operational side also to work on that. So you have daily rental which can be done, and then like Brother Khurram was explaining that you use, since if you are using a backward-looking RFR, it is not available at the time of transaction. So what you do is that you take, like, let's say, I mean, we are taking account of holiday on 25th or January 1st, but general example is there that if your transaction is January 1st, then you will use December 25th rate in this contract and base it on that. So that is one sort of element you can do through this solution, which is approved by IIFM Sharia Board. The next one, please. And this one is making the calculation period to sub-rentals, two sub-rentals. The first rental period will start from the date of pricing, and typically 2 days before the payment date, and then the first sub-rental calculation based on the estimated rate, and then you have second sub-rental period, which will be start once the calculation is final, which is 2 or 5 days before the payment date, and differential amount will be recovered as a rental for the second sub-rental period, which is span over 2 to 5 days. So this is one variation. There's a technicality I know in this one. We can explain later on, inshallah. But just want to make a very brief sort of things that these solutions are basically we have two. So there is an option for industry to use whichever they would like to, which can fit their requirements, inshallah. And we, like Brother Khurram also mentioned, that it's very important that we just focus in a unified manner on these solutions, rather than there could be different other options available. During our consultation, we saw some 3-4 more which are presented to us, and we assess through our industry consultation and work stream consultation on those. And these are the 4 which were found to be the most workable, both from the market perspective and also from the perspective of our Sharia guidance and approval of our Sharia board in this regard. Next slide, please. I think I've finished now. So this is again, the same risk-free rate for the sub-rental to rental, a calculation is provided. So I'm not going to go into this one with the sake of time, but you can see, and this presentation will be, inshallah, available on IIFM website. And I think ISEF, they will do also something, but these will be available. Next slide, please. This is already I have mentioned, and these are the Sharia guidelines which our Sharia board has mentioned. With the sake of time, I will not go into that, but you can see which AOFI standard our Sharia board has recommended to refer, relevant ones. So Muraba standard 8 and monetization Sharia standard number 30, and then Sharia standard number 27, which I mentioned earlier. And each Sharia board has their own institution. So you can see, if next slide, please. With the sake of time, I will just leave these with you. So next slide, please. So these are sort of for Ijara also, standard 9, you can see in each institution they have to do their own assessment. Next slide, please. So this is basically end of my presentation. So thank you very much. Thank you for bearing with me. for additional minutes, inshallah. It was beneficial. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi. And I think we can do a question if the host allows.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ijlal, for this comprehensive presentation. And,
Sheikh, you want to do the question now? You want to do the question now? Or we do the end?
We do the end. It's better. So because Brother Habib is there. So as Mr. Jalal explained, the rebate issue, we have to bear in mind about the rebates, how we deal with the rebates in the agreements, and also the long and the short murabahas. We try to separate them from the Sharia perspective. Therefore, we encourage people always to refer to the Sharia guidelines and Irshadat Shari'iyya for IIFM. So thank you very much. For the fourth speaker, it is enough to mention, or it is enough to mention his name without giving any introduction, without saying anything about him, just to mention his name, because he's well known in the markets. And if you wish, I personally call him encyclopedia of Islamic banking documentation. We work with him for more than 10 years, and I know him and I love him for the sake of Allah. And that is Mr. Habib Montani. So I don't have to say anything about him. You all know him. So over to you, Mr. Habib.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Excellencies, distinguished panelists and guests. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First of all, Dr. Ahmed, thank you for that very kind introduction. And let me also thank IIFM and IILM for inviting me to participate in this important seminar, and to Bank Indonesia for agreeing to host it. As Brother Ijal has mentioned, what I'm going to talk to you about is the hedging segment. Alhamdulillah, IFM has undertaken some important work on the hedging side. And of course, this has been very relevant when we've been looking at the IBOR transition work. And if I can start load my presentation perhaps, and go on to the next slide. So what I wanted to do was to start off with giving some context and parameters to this work that IFM has been doing. And IFM has had a working group looking at the hedging side. And these are some of the principles that they've been working to in producing the work that they have been producing. And the first point, which is an appreciation that IFM, of course, has done, alhamdulillah, some wonderful work on standardization, but we recognize that there is bespoke documentation, bespoke transactions out there. And so in this context, what IFM and the working group has sought to do is to try and come up with a solution, a way forward, which will apply for a majority of participants and a majority of transactions, recognizing that it's not possible to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution for everything. And I'll come back to this point in a second. And the second point to make is that IFM's standardization, hedging standardized standards have been implemented, as you will know, through the Tahud Master Agreement, the TMA. And so, of course, in the context of this work, we've been looking at how the IBORs interrelate with the TMA And the two particular products under the TMA that utilize IBORs are the PRS, the profit rate swap, and the Islamic cross-currency swap. And so again, our focus has been around those two particular products. And actually, it's worth mentioning that the TMA templates themselves don't actually include the IBORs, but we know, of course, that when people put these transactions in place and produce their confirmations and DFT terms confirmations, that they will often have references to IBORs in them. So we've worked particularly at those, with those particular products. And one important point about them to note is that the product standards, the TMA product standards for PRS and ICCS, both use the Murabba structure. So again, that's been the context in which we've been operating. Now, one of the early discussions and surveys, if you will, at the working group level related to how the hedging market structures its transactions. And there was a consensus that in the hedging market, generally speaking, the Murabba's are entered into at the end of the calculation period, at the end of the, for example, the profit period in the case of a profit rate swap. And it's worth saying that's not because the standard documents require that. Actually, they are very flexible and they would accommodate the Murabba being entered into, for example, at the beginning of the period. But the consensus was that, in fact, in the context of the hedging market, the Islamic hedging market, the tendency is to enter into the Murabba on a spot basis at the end of the calculation period. And that's very important because it allows us to draw some conclusions. First of all, that utilizing the backward-looking RFR is something that can be done quite conveniently. It also means that we're aligned in this sense with the conventional market, because when you look at the conventional hedging market and the work, for example, that ISDA has been doing, again, the focus there has been on calculations at the end of the calculation period. And importantly, actually, it gives us the opportunity to adapt some of the conventional market proposals to the work that we are doing. And of course, that helps with ease of use, familiarity, ease of transition, and to a certain degree with liquidity as well. So all of those things have been advantages. But the important point, and this is what I wanted to come back to, is that as market participants, prepare themselves and start implementing their own transition projects, it's very important that they check and take into account their own circumstances. And that will be a whole range of issues, starting obviously with their own Sharia and what's acceptable from their Sharia's perspective, but also looking at regulatory requirements that apply to them, their own local law requirements, their accounting requirements, their transaction structures. Are their transactions ones where the calculation is made at the end of the calculation period or not? Where is the Murabba entered into? Whether the particular hedge that they're looking at is actually hedging an underlying transaction, which is differently structured and needs to be, and therefore the hedge needs to be looked at differently. What currencies are involved, and importantly, counterparty requirements. So all of these things are things that, as you, as individual market participants, look at your own transitioning, it's going to be important for you to evaluate all of these, to examine and evaluate all of these, make sure that from your own perspectives, what's being proposed is the appropriate fit. But alhamdulillah, what the IIFM working group and IIFM has been able to prepare for you is something that we know that the market generally, the Islamic hedging market generally, should be able to use and should be able to transition to with relative ease. So if I can have the next slide, please. So IFM, the hedging working group, IFM's hedging working group, has prepared documentation. If you haven't seen it, it's available through IFM. And the way it approaches this is it has prepared a definitional document. And that definitional document sets out a list of benchmarks for given currencies, and it sets out fallbacks for those benchmarks. The currencies that are set out in the definitional document are US dollars, sterling, euro, Singapore dollar, and Japanese yen. And it's the reason for choosing those currencies was, again, the consensus was those are the most utilized currencies in the context of Islamic hedging. That does not mean other currencies can be ignored or should be ignored. This was really, again, the principle of trying to provide for the market a document that allowed the market as a whole to transition the bulk of its transactions. And so obviously, if you have a different currency, you need to look into how to transition with that. But the principles, hopefully, that are set out in the definitional document will give you a way forward. Equally, for those currencies, what the definitional document does is it sets out a list of benchmarks. And again, that's not intended to be exclusive or comprehensive. It's what the consensus indicated to be the most used benchmarks. So if you have others, identify them, work out how you're going to deal with them. But for the most used benchmarks for those currencies, what this definitional document does is it gives you appropriate definitions of those benchmarks, and then importantly, it gives you fallbacks to be applied as and when those benchmarks cease, those eyeball benchmarks cease to be available. And it sets out the triggers for determining when a particular eyeball benchmark has ceased to be available. And it also gives you a hierarchy of fallbacks. And what I mean by that is it gives you the first fallback to look to, but it also accommodates the possibility that if there are issues subsequently with that particular fallback, you can also then fall back to the next fallback that's set out in the definitional document. And by the way, that's an important provision or element within the definition booklet, because that's the requirement to have robust fallbacks is, as you know, something that the regulators, the international regulators, have been insisting on following the global financial crisis. And so this definitional document is also helping you, if you use it, to address the robust fallback requirements as well. I mentioned that we have some alignment with the conventional market, and what that has allowed us to do is look to documentation, particularly ISDA documentation in the conventional market, and a number of fellow panelists have mentioned ISDA's booklet definitions, supplement 70, and we've been able to utilize that with ISDA's permission, of course, but of course adapting it to our own circumstances. So a lot of the work that the ISDA working groups have done, we've been able to make use of and adapt to create a document that's utilizable and adapted to our own particular circumstances. And what it does is it looks at twofold transactions. It looks at new transactions that you will enter into going forward, but it also looks at legacy transactions, i.e. the transactions that are already entered into and you have outstanding between you and your counterparty. And it requires you to use this definition booklet. You will need to sign up to it. It will be an agreement to be signed up to between you and your counterparty. And by signing up to the definitional booklet, what you'll be doing is creating a bilateral agreement between you and your counterparty, which says that when you then enter into, for example, a DFT terms agreement under the TMA for example, a PRS, that the definitions in the definitional document will apply to your DFT terms confirmation and therefore to your DFT terms transaction and therefore your PRS transaction. And so it incorporates by reference the terms that are set out in the definition booklet document. You don't need to repeat them all. It's a very, your definition, your DFT terms confirmation will need to include a very short sentence cross-referencing the definitional document. And by doing that, you'll bring in all that work and all that thought into your transaction going forward. So it's a very straightforward process of signing up to the definitional document at the beginning and then referencing it in your confirmations as you go forward. So a very, very straightforward way of pulling the definition document into your transactions going forward. And as I say, that's how it'll work in relation to new transactions that you enter into going forward. For your legacy transactions, i.e. your outstanding transactions, there's a separate short bilateral agreement, it's literally a 2-pager, which essentially incorporates by definition the definitions, incorporates by reference rather, the definitional document into those existing transactions. And again, by doing that, what it's doing, it's picking up on the IBOR benchmarks that you currently have in those transactions. It's then telling you what the triggers will be to apply for deciding when a particular benchmark has ceased to be available or is no longer utilizable, what the applicable fallback is at that point, and how to identify that fallback. And indeed, the hierarchy, the same hierarchy of fallbacks will apply as with the new transactions. I want to make the point that this is not a protocol approach. We know that in the conventional market, we've seen the idea of an ISDA protocol. That's not the approach that's been taken here. And that's because the circumstances of this market are not the same as the conventional market. And it's important that you, as an individual market participant, I think, are clear what you require for your own circumstances, and then liaise with your counterparties and communicate with them and agree with them, importantly, how you want to go forward. And that's why the structure that we've provided for here is in both cases for new trades and legacy trades, an agreement that you'll enter into. But it's a very straightforward process to enter into the documentation. It doesn't involve a lot of new bits of paper. So that I can stop there because A, I'm running out of time, but B, because I think I've covered the main points. Obviously, there's an opportunity to ask questions afterwards. But again, I want to leave you with the thoughts that, what we've developed is something that will cover the majority of transactions and the majority of uses of these benchmarks. My fellow panelists have already talked about the questions about how those benchmarks have been, the new benchmarks have been determined and calculated, the issue of compounding, etc. So all of the things that they've explained are built into this document that we've developed. So there's no compounding within your own transaction as a result of you're using these benchmarks. Any compounding is built into the benchmarks themselves, and you're simply cross-referencing the benchmark itself. So thank you very much. I'll stop there, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to deal with them. Thank you very much for your attention.
MashaAllah, tabarakallah. Thank you very much, Mr. Habib, for this comprehensive presentation. Inshallah, soon IIFM will launch these definitions, documentation, ta'ala. Before we go into the question and answers, I think it's better to just listen to our brother from IILM, and then we go for that. And I can see our brothers in Jakarta, always the pressurized Mr. Ijlal to finish. So I hope that da ambil makanan tengah hari. Kita di sini belumlah. So kita lapar juga. So inshallah boleh ambil teh tarik dah. So you can have a rest. So our brother Hashim, if I can call him Hashim, is that Hashim, right?
Assalamualaikum, it's Hisham.
Naam?
Hisham.
Hisham, brother Hisham. Because the written I really don't know what is that exactly. I know it's from Morocco, so sometimes you write things. Exactly. So brother Hisham is our fifth and final speaker from IILM. He is the Executive Director of Business Operations. Brother Hashim, as from my understanding, is among the excellent team of IILM and has contributed a lot to the success of IILM and known for his vast experience in the field of scope. So with that note, I will hand over to Brother Hisham. So inshallah to benefit us with his presentation.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, Brother Ahmed, for the introduction. And after all this very interesting presentation from my fellow panelists, I'll try to end today's session with sharing our experience at the IILM. And thank you very much for allowing us to share what we've been doing at the IILM. Basically, I will try to address a global question, which is, can the Islamic industry come up with its own benchmark? Because we are referring to risk-free rates as conventional rate, and as Brother Kuram said earlier when he started his presentation, it's of course it's permissible to use conventional benchmark, but can we come up with something interesting that could be considered by the Islamic finance as a pricing guidance and as a new benchmark? So please, if you can have the presentation. Thank you. Next, please. So basically, I will start with a brief overview about what we have been doing at the IILM before moving on what we believe is needed to be recognized as a benchmark rate and what would be the next steps. Please, next. And next slide also. Thank you. So for those who are not familiar with the IILM, and quickly, for those who already know what we do not sound boring, but basically the IILM has been established by several central banks and one multilateral organization, which is ICD, to tackle an issue which was the shortage of liquidity instrument for the Islamic financial institution. So it has been established in 2010. And since then, we have worked on providing the market with Islamic liquidity instrument. Next slide, please. So here, just to show where we are coming from, before we move to the more interesting discussion regarding the benchmark rate. Before the IILM was created, we had only few alternative instruments available for the Islamic financial institution to manage their excess cash. Of course, the long-term sukuk, community murabaha, and some central bank tools. And of course, the other opportunity was just to leave cash idle for the Islamic banks. And we realized that, of course, it was affecting their profitability and competitiveness versus the conventional peers. And some instruments like murabaha or even the long-term sukuk were not enough, were not flexible like murabaha, or are not enough liquid in the market for the institution to get their cash before maturity in case they need. Next slide, please. So what we came up with after now more than 10 years of existence and about 7 years in the market, what we came up with is an ABCP programs, which is unique. It's asset-backed commercial paper, one of its kind, an Islamic program where we issue short-term instrument regularly in the market. We provide different tenors, and we provide different tenors for like investment tools for the market to invest in. I've seen some notes about the sound. I hope you can hear me well. Okay, so the IILM is focusing on providing a high quality instrument. So we issue short-term sukuk that are basically backed by long-term assets. And referring to what Brother Islal was saying earlier, what we have in long-term assets that are linked to sovereign or sovereign-linked credit exposure, I base currently on LIBOR. Of course, we have like our institution fallback language, and we are on our origination efforts for new assets. We are considering using the new benchmark rates as a SOFR potentially. But here to focus on what we came up with, now we have an infrastructure, which is our issuance program, issuing these short-term instruments through primary dealers worldwide that are considered and widely accepted because of our tangibility ratio as an Islamic instrument. And since few years now, we managed to get liquidity for our paper with an active secondary market, much more active than what it used to be previously. And this is the nature also of our instrument. It's a very short-term instrument that even if you don't manage to get liquidity on the secondary market, the maturity is very short, so you can get back your money very quick. So please on the next slide, where we're going to focus on what we believe is needed to build a benchmark rate. Please, next slide. Thank you. So the benchmark rate basically will serve as a price reference for the industry. And there are a few criteria that needs to be taken into account. Of course, you need to have a large supply in the market. What we have done on our side, we have increased our program size last year to $4 billion program. And because our business model is to reissue each short-term sukuk that are maturing, last year we reached a total turnover of $12 billion in the market. This year we expect to be around $13 to $14 billion. So it looks big, but compared to the total size of the Islamic finance industry, we still have rooms to grow. And the importance of having a large issue size is not only for the liquidity, but of course for improving the price at secondary market in terms of bid offer spread. If you look at the US Treasury, which is a very large market and serve as a benchmark, and of course the LIBOR is a premium above the US T-bills. What we see is the more we issue, the more liquidity we see in the secondary market. The US Treasuries trade at 1 to 2 basis point bid offer spread, but on our side, it's still a young market that we're trying to develop. The second point is the provide consistency in our issuances with key maturities. So key maturities currently what we're issuing are 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months. Very regularly, we are in the market every month now. When we started issuing, of course, we were issuing only like 3 or 4 times a year. Now we have built up some frequency to the market, which give confidence to investors when they hold our paper to sell it before maturity if they need cash, because they know that the IILM will issue another paper, in the next few days or next few weeks. So this is the current frequency of our issuances. And in terms of maturities or tenor, we started issuing only 3-month paper. And because of we are kind of market or demand driven, based on our roadshow and feedback from our primary dealers, we have increased our offer from 1 month and 6 months. We also have issue over tenors like 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But the main tenor we are focusing now is to offer 1, 3, and 6 months every month, basically. And last but not least is to offer what we call a standardized instrument, to make sure it's spread its awareness and give again confidence to the investors, which will make its trading volume increase, and market making capacity from our primary dealers also possible. Each sukuk that we issue are done out of our issuance program, which carry a rating which is A1 by S&P, one of the highest short-term rating. And each sukuk issue under the program is similar and is fungible. We also, another important thing to make it potentially a benchmark, it's the pricing discovery and pricing transparency. I will come to that in the next slides. But what we're referring to, as some of my fellow panelists explained earlier, why the LIBOR is being discontinued is because of the lack of transparency in establishing this benchmark, because it was contributed by different banks, and it was, as Brother Karam said earlier, because of the what was at stake, the amount of investment or swap or trades that were depending on this benchmark was so huge, in trillions of dollars. The natural behavior or human behavior could take the risk of having this abuse in terms of LIBOR contribution. So here, the difference, what we do here at the IILM, we let the market set the pricing. We move from agreed bid to competitive bidding. So the market can decide on each security that we issue which price we think fit the most for this particular tenor. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So here to take about just want to share about our track record and the size that now we're issuing in the market. So when we started issuing, we started at 490 million. Now we have a program of $4 billion, I was saying, so which allows us to issue much more in the market regularly at benchmark size. We try to issue at around 1 billion to more every month to address the demand. We always oversubscribed. There is a strong demand for our paper, alhamdulillah, for the past few years. And last year, during the pandemic, we have increased our offer by our program by 80%. So our standing total size from 1.96 to 3.5 billion. We have issued a total of more than 70 billion through 155 sukuk issuances. Next slide, please. So here, this is an interesting slide. It's the position of the IILM in the market. As I was saying, we are a unique Islamic asset-backed commercial paper. So asset-backed commercial paper focus on very short term. So when we talk about building a yield curve, we are more talking about developing a money market curve, which means issuing up to 1 year. So currently we are been issuing and focusing between 1 month and 6 months, with more than 70% of our offering on the 1 and 3 months, which are tenors used for liquidity management purpose. And you see that most of the other sukuk issuances are focusing on 3 years and above. So the total year to date of issuances is above 40 billion. We currently represent 30% of these issuances, public issuances, not private placements. But if you look at the very short term, we are the only one issuing short term Islamic instrument in dollars. Why in dollars? So it can be traded cross-border. Of course, you have over short-term Islamic instruments which allow to develop a curve, but it's more on the local side, in local jurisdiction, like, for example, Bank Negara Malaysia in Malaysia and other countries. But what we are doing at the IILM as an international organization is to develop an international curve. Next slide, please. Here, just to show how the total size that we have been issuing have been growing. So in 2019, we have been at 9 billion total turnover. Last year, around 12 billion, and this year we expect to be at 13, 14 billion. So by increasing our program and increasing our offer, we can reach what we call benchmark size, which is accepted by the market, which is around 400 to 500 million per sukuk, which give enough inventories to the market to be able to trade it at secondary, because the problem with issuing too small size per tenor will make it will just make investors to hold till maturity rather than exchanging it at secondary. And to reach a benchmark kind of rates, you need to have an active secondary market. So I'll come to that on the next slide, please. Okay, before moving to the secondary market, here just to show on a 1 year rolling what we have been offering to the market, as I was saying, constantly offering 3 tenors on a monthly basis, 1 month, 3 month, and 6 month. And of course, you can see the oversubscription rates that vary depending on the, on the demand on the month or the seasonality effect. For example, for the last auction we had in October, we had a strong interest for the very short term on the 1 month specifically because of the current uncertainty, fear linked to the rising inflation, fear of also from the regulators to start the tapering and increasing the rates. People and investors on the Islamic side are specifically parking cash on the short term. So we had a lot of interest on the 1 month. So again, on the price reference as a benchmark rate, what's important is to make sure that this pricing reflect real market condition, a real market appetite for this sukuk. Next slide, please. Next, please. Okay. Here, just to show briefly the liquidity, the secondary market and our transaction on our sukuk, again, for the past 3 years. Of course, last year was, we saw a drop in the secondary market activity, specifically because of the pandemic. What we have noticed that the IILM, A1 short-term sukuk backed by sovereign assets, has become what we can say a safe haven instrument, where we have noticed our investors, especially in March and April, during the uncertainty linked to the pandemic, the peak of the pandemic and a small liquidity squeeze we have seen in the market, decided to hold the IILM sukuk till maturity rather than trading it more actively in the secondary market. But of course, since beginning of this year, it has started again to trade with higher number on a monthly basis. Of course, summertime is low, is linked to the seasonality effect. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here is a screenshot of our Bloomberg auction platform, which allow us to issue on a regular basis our what we call our sukuk. So basically, we issue through competitive bidding methodology, where we let the primary dealers set up the pricing they wish for each securities we offer in the market. The way how we allocate our investors or primary dealers are different than a book building. We don't decide or reallocate based on the share that we want to see, which like GCC, we want GCC to hold X amount of our paper in Southeast Asia, X amount, or each type of investors. We don't do that. Basically, it's on the lowest yield, get it first. And we try to make sure it's independent and transparent methodology. So the rules are known to the market in advance. They never change unless it's announced in advance to the market. And basically what happened is once we reach the total size of the amount we want to issue, so here 500 million, for instance, all the successful bidders will be allocated at the highest or the cutoff, what we call the cutoff profit rate. The cutoff profit rate is the rate at which we reach the total size we want to issue. So here it's 43 basis points, for instance. So all successful bidders will be allocated at 43 basis points. So this is what we call a uniform price auction that is competitive. So the market competes and in the same way as the US Treasury, for example, auctions, at which price they are willing to take the security, the IILM Sukuk. So next, please. So since we moved to what I just explained, competitive bidding methodology in 2018, we managed to have enough data to build half of the money market curve because it's stuck to the 6 month. We issue only 1, 3, and 6 month at the moment. But here it's just to show for this year on a monthly basis, what did the market price for each securities we issue basically. And as I was explaining earlier, here you can see that the 1 month dropped drastically for the past few auctions, specifically because of the strong interest from the market for a very short-term instrument to park cash on the very short term, basically. The 6 month used to be traded at the same level as before, around 35 basis points, which shows less interest for the market for this tenor, but more for the 1 and 3 month, which is again reflect, or what we're trying to do with the IILM Sukuk is reflect the pricing, the real pricing based on market conditions, the market demand, basically. Next slide, please. Here, I just wanted to give you a brief snapshot of our investors. Of course, based on our mandate, we want to make sure that the IILM Sukuk land on the balance sheet of Islamic financial institution, so they can use it for liquidity management purpose. But of course, we have also commercial investors buying our paper, and which is important also because one of the main reasons why we have been created is to help to avoid any systemic risk and help support the stability of the Islamic finance industry. So if you have only Islamic investors buying the security and anything happened to this Islamic institution, you may have a systemic risk. Here, what we try to do is to spread awareness as much as possible to commercial investors also, different type of investors, banks, of course, to manage their liquidity, but also we have public sector buying the Sukuk on a regular basis, supranational central banks, a bit more of pension fund and asset manager lately. So when Islamic banks specifically needs to get liquidity before the maturity of each Sukuk, they can sell the IILM Sukuk to the market because there are enough players now in the market that knows about the IILM, that have lines in place, and that like the credit exposure of our paper. Next slide, please. Here, just to show now this is as of today where our paper is being sold or purchased by investors in these countries. When we started, it was really focusing only on some GCC countries and Southeast Asia. But now we have extended, I would say, Middle East from Turkey till Pakistan. We have more interest from Europe and Africa, despite issuing in dollars. But this is beauty of issuing in reserve currency, is to make it available for a lot of different, range of players across the world. And the more players we have, the more liquidity we can have for our security. Yeah, next slide, please. I will not spend much time because my colleagues already spoke about the difference between the risk-free rates in the like of SOFR and SONIA and the current LIBOR. But what I want just to highlight maybe is the difference with the IILM. So the SOFR the secured overnight financing rate in USD is a measure of the cost borrowing cash overnight with collateralized by the US Treasury. On our side, what we offer is an investment security, which is different than collateralized SOFR, because SOFR is mainly based on the repo market. So the IILM also could play a role to help developing an Islamic benchmark if we also help developing this Islamic repo framework that we have worked on with our colleagues from IIFM, IFSB, and ISDB when we arranged this year the 5th IILM Sharia Roundtable that was focusing on developing an Islamic repo market. So the IILM could be one of the Islamic security used as collateral for this kind of Islamic repo transaction, and then you could develop an Islamic related benchmark similar to what we have on the SOFR, for instance, based on real transaction. But what we think now, what we're trying to do on extending our mandate, not only by providing Islamic solutions to the market, but also potentially setting up the ground for becoming a benchmark rate recognized as pricing reference for the Islamic industry, is being like a risk-free rate. So the question is, what is a risk-free rate? Theoretically, rate of return for investment considered as zero risk by the market. So we try to, of course, we are A1, you have one notch above, which is A1 plus, but consequence of that will be the pricing will be much lower for the market. But the fact that our short-term sukuk is backed by sovereign obligation make it very safe and sound. The program that we have is mercury remote and give confidence to the investor that when they buy the IILM sukuk, they hold a share of sovereign debt obligations. So also the difference with the current, I mean, the next risk-free rates being used already by the market in terms of reduction is what we issue right now is monthly. Market reference rates are available in the market and commercial market are daily. It's one of the main difference at the moment. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just to come to the, I think it will be my last slide. So as I was explaining, we came up with, after 10 years, or I would say less than 10 years in the market, providing the Islamic financial institution with a high credit quality instrument that is tradable, that is already traded through 10 primary dealers in the market, widely accepted under Sharia principle, because we have currently a high tangibility ratio, which is around 80%, which make it acceptable by all and different jurisdiction, because each jurisdiction has its own understanding. But compared to the IOFI minimum requirement of 51% to make sure the sukuk is tradable, we aim at having the highest tangibility ratio, and of course denominated in dollars, so it can be traded internationally. So the question now is how we can help the Islamic industry, and what we think we're going to focus on the next few years to continue the work that we have been doing to fulfill our mandate and potentially to help with identifying a potential Islamic benchmark, which would help also the market and the industry to enhance the liquidity, especially on the Islamic side. Based on the current program, of course, we can increase and reach 4 keys market standard maturities, because we have been showing only 1, 3, and 6, as I was saying. So we can go to the maximum tenor capacity or maturity of our program, which is 12 months, which we are currently thinking about. It will allow us to hire or increase target size of our program, which is only 4 billion at the moment, which will be really a catalyst to build up this benchmark yield curve. Also increase the frequency. As I was saying, we from issuing only a few times a year, now we are every month in the market, which give confidence to investors that they can buy at primary new IILM sukuk every month, which is very good. We have seen the result in terms of demand and investor behavior. But we believe when the market is ready, we may be able to issue more frequently on a twice a month or even on a weekly basis, but only when the markets will be ready, hopefully. On the secondary, which is a key challenge for the continuity of a benchmark yield, is to ensure that the price reference is always available and updated and tradable, and especially during disruptive or disruption in the market or crisis, especially what we have noticed last year, when the liquidity tend to be limited. You need to have a high liquid market, and this is what we miss globally in the Islamic industry. Again, it links to the players. The more investors we have, the better for the liquidity. Currently, we have a majority of Islamic investors. We don't have all the Islamic banks yet buying our paper. Not all the jurisdictions are buying the Islamic, the IILM sukuk yet. But we have a growing investor base. And of course, enhancing different things on our program will attract more investors. One thing I didn't speak about, which is very important, is the HQLA treatment. We benefit from several jurisdictions, central banks and regulators, which make it appropriate for the Basel III LCR ratio for investors to hold our paper. Also, this is make it attractive, and we have seen a grow investor base. And when the Basel III will be fully implemented in jurisdiction where they have Islamic banks, we foresee more and more banks buying our paper. Of course, developing secondary market, I was saying, is key to help with a benchmark yield curve and really recognize benchmark rates. What I was saying earlier, our money market curve is focusing on the primary, but if you look at the US Treasury curve, you have the secondary also that is traded on a daily basis. Then you see it moving live in Bloomberg, for instance. We're not there yet, but we are seeing more demand for our paper at secondary, and we have very active primary dealers for our paper. So of course, it's linked also to the size. The more supply we offer to the market, the higher liquidity we will see, inshallah. So in conclusion, the depth and breadth of the market will improve over time. This is the price discovery, and increasing our issuances also will help to break the liquidity cycle, I would say. We believe we should continue work together. As Brother Israel was saying, it's not only one institution or one-man show. We need to work toward this common goal with all the international bodies. As I said earlier, we worked this year on trying to develop an Islamic repo framework, but coming up with an Islamic benchmark from the Islamic industry, I think will be very important for all the Islamic financial institutions. We have data. We have been developing data, and our data have been growing over the years, and hopefully, inshallah, will keep growing. But we need to all come together, international bodies, regulators, but also investors, players, to help us grow also our program. So the more investors we have, the more liquidity we'll see, and the more relevant the IILM pricing or sukuk pricing will become for the Islamic industry. Thank you very much for your attention, and we'll be happy to take any question.
Thank you very much, Brother Hisham, for this comprehensive, informative, presentation. We know that we exceed the time sets, but now we are approaching, the end of this beneficial seminar. As saying goes, to every beginning there is an ending. But before the seminar come to its end, I'd like to invite Mr. Ijlan for the Q&A in short closing remarks. So once again, thank you very much for gracing IIFM IILM seminar with your presence. and we really appreciate it. Over to you, Abu Maham. Thank you very much.
Once again, Assalamu alaikum, shukran, Sheikh Ahmed. So if the host can open the mics for others also, so we'll just have a few minutes, few remarks. I think it will be good from the speakers. A few Q&As been already, I understand, answers have been given. But I would like to just, I think, if other speakers can also open up. So just few questions, and my closing is basically will be just 1 minute of thanking. So I think I will just request if the mics are open for the panelists. From our side, I think what the questions I've seen, one question is what other transactions are impacted. So if there's any comment for risk-free rates where forward-looking rate is needed and the case is backward-looking. So that's one question. Maybe if somebody wants to take that. There was a question on the why hedging. It's a risk mitigation, and what our friend Habib has explained. IIFM has not issued the standard yet for the hedging. So these are still, as I have mentioned, will be issued, but he has briefed what the market should expect when these are guided by a Sharia board and also approved by a Sharia board in coming months, like I said earlier. So those are not really available yet. There is a question on that. Then there is of course, I hope all of you understand now the difference and key challenges between IBOR and risk-free rate or alternate benchmark rates. There's a question, on some other topics like ESG related issues and all. That's something which also IFM do look into those, and those are the other forum which we will be inshallah discussing, including some fintech related areas which are as part of our mandate if it involves documentation side and others which we know. I think one question would be interesting to see, the domestic rates. So naturally, for the currencies we have mentioned, those are called main currencies. If you are using that currency, naturally you have to use that rate, whether it's SOF4 or SONIA or others. So if domestic level, if somebody wants to basically, mention certain things, if there's some development, please go ahead. If Brother Khurram or Brother Mustafa in particular would like to take that. If you like. So I know some domestic level, maybe certain things are done for the domestic currencies, still maybe work in progress. So that's one question, which I think generally we can do. So there are two main, I think one for benefit of others, maybe on the product side, if there are other products, of course, are there like Musharaka, if they are used, so these solutions can, be used for that, in my view. So, Brother Khurram, if I may start with you, and then others can enjoy. Just one minute, and I think you can.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much, Brother Jalal. I'll address the product question, and maybe Brother Mustafa can address the domestic rates question. So, yes, any Islamic finance structure that can reference a benchmark for pricing purposes, and mostly we know that it happens when you have a long-term transaction, where the transaction tenor is longer than 6 months or 1 year. That's typically when the transactions tend to be linked to an independent benchmark. I would say majority of the volumes are currently under Murabaha and Ijara or diminished Musharaka structures. But we have seen in some cases Musharaka structures also being used in a format that can reference an independent benchmark. So Musharaka structures can also potentially be a use case for these RFR rates. But in effect, you can use it for any structure where referencing is being done.
Thank you for that. Mustafa, you have any sort of update in other regional
Yes.
or other, so maybe that will be useful.
Thank you, Brother Ijlal. And I just want to add, to what Brother Khurram was mentioning regarding the contracts. So when the exercise, regarding the transition to risk-free rates was done, the administrators of the different things had laid out their expectation as to which rate they expect different jurisdictions or different types of instruments to be adopted. So, it's understood that the risk-free rate, the overnight rate, is primarily going to be used for overnight, transactions. The backward-looking compounded rate, it was their expectation that this would be utilized in derivatives. It would be utilized in conventional bonds. It would be utilized in securitized projects and in the loans market. So this is something that, in their initial reports they had written, and the forward-looking term rates, they were expecting, again, adoption in loans, adoption in trade finance and working capital markets, and possibly in the transition of legacy derivatives, once the transition was being done. And Islamic finance in certain markets like the UK, the Bank of England highlighted Islamic finance as being an area that, would, from as per their expectation, adopt the forward-looking rate because of the restrictions. So there is a lot of guidelines around what the expectations were of these contracts, and they have looked at a wide selection of contracts. But again, they're not enforcing this restriction. They're providing these as guidelines and their expectations. The only restriction is that contracts in those jurisdictions cannot quote LIBOR once the enforcement comes in to not quote LIBOR. In the UK, that has already come in June, and in other jurisdictions that will roll out for different contracts. In terms of other jurisdictions, I think most markets primarily are still looking at contribution-based, interbank rates, and the reason for that is, in a lot of markets, you don't have the depth in the derivatives market to be able to utilize OIS to, take the risk-free overnight rate and then extend it to a term rate. We're seeing Hong Kong, Australia, Canada, and Singapore starting to do that, where they're starting to build that out in their local markets. But it's still going to take some time for a number of markets to do that. If you don't do that calculation using the OIS market, then again, you're going back to a quotation-based system where you take the risk-free rate, but the additional spread that you add on to it for the forward-looking terms is based on contribution rather than real transactions. So that is a challenge that jurisdictions are tackling. It's still very much a wait-and-see approach for them to see how this pans out. But one of the prerequisites of it, and this was a challenge that the US faced in their SOFR rates, was to have depth in the derivatives market, which is, again, a challenge that, different, stakeholders are looking at.
Right. Thank you for that. And Habib, before I come final to Hisham again, because his suggestion was well taken from IILM. But Habib, you have anything? Generally, the question is more, broader in terms of, the Islamic, what we have developed over the years, and we have been involved right through more than 10 years. Now, it's about risk mitigation. So from, what you have seen, so what is your sort of experience, how the hedging, in terms of developed, and how, it's meeting that, what was needed for the industry to develop?
Yes, I think alhamdulillah, the work that IIFM has done to standardize the hedging products has helped to develop a more liquid market. But the focus, as you know, has been on those products which are most utilized. So, for example, the PRS, the ICCS, FX, and of those, the ones that utilize the rates, the IBOR rates at the moment are the PRS and ICCS, as we discussed. So I think we've seen a lot of depth created in the hedging market. I think the value and importance and the risk mitigation importance of Islamic hedging has certainly come to the fore and has become much better and now well understood. I'm sure there are other products that we will move forward to, but it is, I think, a question of being demand driven and where is the sort of the broad demand, the general demand, rather than necessarily bespoke items. There are hedging transactions, for example, on the equity side and so on. But in terms of being able to develop a market consensus and a general approach, I think we need to move in the organized and careful way that IIFM has been doing to date, and inshallah, with the work that IILM is doing, there may be opportunities through that to develop further products. But it is a thought through and careful process, and I think the market has benefited from that.
Thank you, Habib. Thank you for that. And finally, Brother Hisham, thank you for that detailed presentation. IILM Sukuk issuances and then leading towards curve where we can possibly look into the rate for Islamic. So I think that is what probably you mentioned. So would you like to add any further thing on that issue, or still naturally we have to do further consultation and all and see if your issuances are mostly dollar, if I understand. So it's already software is there, but again, these are some of the what I'm trying to allude is the challenges which we will be discussing later on, not today. Naturally, it's a huge issue. So would you like to add something on that before we close, inshallah?
Yes, thank you very much, Brother Islal. I think, as you rightly said, the market is already transitioning to the use of these risk-free rates and the lack of SOFR, for example, for the USD. Based on our experience and our discussion with international banks, already we have seen some shift, especially from the European market. GCC has started already with especially ISDB issuing their first Sukuk linked to SOFR. And as I was sharing earlier, similarly on our private placements on the long term, the assets that are backing our short-term Sukuk, we are already considering the new potential private placement in using this new benchmark. So I believe what we are doing, we will continue growing our footprint in the market, becoming a bigger, taking more space, especially on the money market side, and trying to have and broaden our investor base, because as I was saying, the more investors we have, the better, and the better credibility will be for the IILM Sukuk to become and recognized as a real benchmark. As Brother Habib was saying, we're more demand driven, so it's what the market need and what the market is willing to take and accept as a benchmark potentially in future. So on our side, we are here, we're happy to work together, and we know it's an ongoing process. It will take some time, but we are trying to set up the ground for potential Islamic benchmark to be ready and to complete the curve. So even on our side, we have demand to start issuing in our recent currency, i.e. GBP or Euro, for instance. And again, we are market demand, but we really want to continue focusing on completing our, or what we can say, the first Islamic benchmark or money market curve in dollars that can be traded internationally.
Well, thank you for that. Another one last note, given rule and Sukuk and looking at that, as Brother Hisham alluded, I think what they are using for short-term Sukuk is the risk-free rate, backward looking. So probably the need for forward looking maybe at times is not there, if I understand correctly. And most of the Sukuk in any case are basically on the other benchmark like mid-swap rates and all. So that's why as of now we don't have exact sort of what our assessment still will continue for Sukuk. That's why we have not come out with any real sort of a challenge in this regard. So maybe like Mustafa was mentioning, certain things may come around for Sukuk, but as of now, from IIFM, this is something which we continue to assess. With that note, I think we have already exceeded our time, and I understand VI has some other event also. So we are really thankful. It's late there also as well. Really thankful to all of you. And again, the message is same. Need for cooperation, and also for IIFM, we really request industry players to help us and join us in our quest, inshallah, and other bodies as well. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you to all. MashaAllah. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
Jazakumullah khairan. Terima kasih kawan-kawan saudara-saudari di Indonesia. Terima kasih banyak. May Allah reward you for all what you do. And once again, thank you everyone for gracing IILM seminar with your presence, and we really appreciate it. Terima kasih banyak. InsyaAllah jumpa lagi. Saya nampak Brother Hisham macam live ini.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih banyak. Jumpa lagi insyaAllah.
Assalamualaikum brothers.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.